She was born in a lab, not a home, and the first thing they took from her was her name. This is the story of Darth Maladi, the mind behind the virus, the torturer of thought, the shadow scientist of the One Sith. A child was born on a world no one would ever name. There were no midwives, no celebration, no family, only silence. Her cries didn't echo through halls or homes. They vanished into cold stone walls, beneath red banners, behind the masks of watching Sith. She wasn't swaddled in cloth. She was wrapped in prophecy, raised not for love, but for function. Long before she was Darth Maladi, she was nothing, not metaphorically. Literally, the One Sith did not allow children to become something. They were made, sculpted, gutted, built from trauma and command. In the hidden sanctums beneath Coruscant and other dark corners of the unknown regions, Darth Krayt's agents raised their next generation in the dark, away from the Force, away from memory, away from themselves. They didn't call her girl or daughter or apprentice. To them she was property, an experiment, a question waiting for an answer only pain could provide. What happens when you strip a being of everything, except their ability to learn? Her earliest memories were of white walls, not darkness, clean, blinding, medical. Not the filth and rot of Sith tombs, but sterile chambers humming with needles, wires, and breathing machines. The One Sith did not rely on tradition. They evolved it, they dissected it, and she was among their first subjects. In these early years, language was offered only as necessity. She learned commands before she learned comfort. Stand, obey, silence. Speech was not encouraged. Expression was punished. Emotions were not to be hidden, they were to be exterminated. No name meant no history, and no history meant no resistance. Other children came and went. Few survived. Those who did were either broken or changed. She was neither. She listened. She watched. She didn't cry when her hand was burned for hesitation. She didn't flinch when a cage mate disappeared overnight. If anything, she became quieter. There was no affection. The handlers, robed Sith agents who rarely spoke above a whisper, rotated weekly. She never saw the same face twice. Eventually, she stopped trying to recognize them. It didn't matter. They weren't there to protect her. They were there to measure progress, neural response, reflex under duress, emotional degradation. The first time she heard the word force, it was not in reverence. It was clinical. They tested her blood, her reflexes, her tolerance for sedatives and stress. Midi-chlorian counts weren't praised. They were catalogued, logged, compared against other candidates. There was no celebration in being force-sensitive. It simply meant you were now eligible for something worse. The others sometimes whispered at night, in the few seconds before sleep was enforced with sound pulse induction. They whispered about Darth Krayt, a name said with both awe and dread. She listened. She had no image of him. Only the symbol tattooed into every surface, the red eye, the watching wound. There were no windows. She learned the passage of time not by sun or stars, but by the rhythm of meals, tests, and pain. Once, when she was 6, or close to it, they let her hold a training saber. It was not turned on. It was not meant for combat. It was placed in her hands only so they could measure how her fingers moved around it, how her gaze shifted, how her breathing changed. She did not ask what it was. She had already learned curiosity led to punishment, but obedience led to attention, and attention was the only currency that meant survival. That same year she was selected for isolation, a different chamber, quieter. Fewer footsteps outside the door, more needles, new smells, acid, smoke, something else, something alive. She wasn't told why, but in the solitude, something changed. She began to feel. Not hope, not fear, pattern. She could sense when the guards were lying, when the air felt wrong, when pain was coming, not because she heard it, but because it pulsed in the force around her. The force did not speak, but it trembled, and she trembled with it. Still, she said nothing, because no one wanted her to feel. They wanted her to become. By the time she was 7, she had forgotten the sound of her own name, if she ever had one, and soon the tests would change. Because now she was ready for lessons, real ones, the kind that left scars where memories used to live. She sat cross-legged on the cold floor, eyes open, spine straight, lips sealed. The room had no furniture, no color, only shadow and a single glow panel above, too dim to warm the space, too bright to ignore. The lessons began without words. Her first instructor did not speak. He moved, slowly, deliberately, a gesture of the hand, a flare of the nostrils, the narrowing of eyes. Every signal had a meaning, and every meaning carried consequence. When she failed to mirror his stance, she was struck, not with anger, not with passion, only precision, like a chisel tapping stone. She did not cry. That reaction had already been trained out of her. Instead, she studied more closely. Pain wasn't random here, it was method. Each blow was placed like punctuation in a sentence she hadn't finished reading. Every mistake brought clarity. Every success brought silence. And in that silence a dangerous truth began to form. She was learning. Not like a Jedi learns, like a weapon does. They taught her about the Force the same way they taught anatomy, piece by piece, as something to dissect. There was no philosophy, no balance, no peace, only control. The Force, they said, was a muscle, one to be strengthened through stress, sharpened through suffering, and broken open through will. When her limbs ached too much to stand, they injected her, stimulants first, then sedatives, then neurotoxins, tiny doses, just enough to confuse her senses. When she learned to push through nausea and hallucination, they added electrical pulses. When she mastered that, they flooded her mind with the memories of others, real or simulated, it didn't matter. At night, she lay on a flat slab of durasteel, heart pounding, breath shallow, fingers twitching involuntarily from hours of mental assault. But she said nothing. Each day, the line between her and the training blurred. She didn't remember what she liked, what she feared, only what she had learned. How to paralyze a humanoid in 3 motions, how to project calm while sensing betrayal, how to mask her Force presence entirely. She learned how to lie before she learned how to speak in full sentences. When she was 9, they took her to a lab, not the kind she had grown up in. This one smelled of ash and wet stone, ancient, ritualistic. At its center sat a Sith alchemy table, black and slick with dried remnants of failed creations. There she was introduced to suffering on a molecular level. They placed an animal before her, weak, broken, dying, a test. Heal it, they said, but not with kindness, with control, with command. She failed the first time. It died. She was punished, not physically, but chemically. A new toxin, one that made her hallucinate her own screams, replayed back at her with increasing speed until she begged for silence without opening her mouth. The second time she succeeded, the creature twitched, its lungs inflated. And then they told her to kill it. She did. Not because she hated it, because she didn't feel anything at all. That was the goal. That was the proof. From that point forward, they trusted her with real knowledge, with alchemical texts, with syringes that could bypass the nervous system, with scalpels designed for Force-resistant tissue, with code sequences used to override ship security. She had passed beyond discipline. She had entered design. They began giving her missions, not in the field, not yet, but simulations, political sabotage, enemy interrogation, memory rewrites. Her job was not to destroy, but to hollow, to leave targets walking, breathing, but empty. When she succeeded, they gave her a reward. Not food, not warmth. A name. Not hers, never hers. But the first time she was allowed to choose a designation for a test subject, she understood. Names were not given to preserve identity. They were given to control it. And soon, she would be asked to give herself one. But not yet. First, she had to survive the next phase. The one where the body no longer breaks. Only the mind does. She had stopped dreaming years ago, but the nightmares never stopped. By the time she was 10, sleep was no longer rest, it was programming, and every night her mind was reshaped while her body remained still, twitching, sweating, jaw clenched as memory loops played behind her closed eyes. She wasn't alone in the chambers anymore. Not physically, but the faces around her were hollow. Candidates like her, some younger, some older, each one silent. Each one watched. Some would vanish after a test. Others would return with marks they didn't have before. No one asked questions. The silence was the only thing they still shared. This phase wasn't set about physical endurance. It was about whether a mind could be pushed beyond its shape and still come back functional. They started with sensory flooding. Hours of static light, endless walls of noise, not painful, just constant. Sometimes, a single word repeated until its meaning vanished. Control, control, control. Then came inversion. Her hands moved, but she felt nothing. Her voice screamed, but no sound came. They induced hallucinations, projected false images of her own face speaking to her, accusing her, instructing her. They made her doubt what was real. And yet, she adapted. Not by resisting, but by surrendering structure. She stopped holding on to facts. She stopped needing to know what day it was, what planet she was on, whether her instructors were the same ones from yesterday. Time wasn't a sequence anymore. It was a pressure system. You endured it, or you broke. She endured. They started letting her see herself. At first, it was a mirror, cracked. Then a holoscreen recording of her in combat drills. Then dreams, projected through a Sith meditation device, where she was a shadow moving through memory, sometimes as herself, sometimes as someone else. She watched a woman die on a hospital floor, watched a man stab his teacher, watched herself hesitate. That was when they increased the dosage. The force was no longer a current she learned to sense. It became the language of her trauma. She felt death before it happened, felt betrayal before it was spoken, felt emptiness before it arrived. Her instructors monitored her brain constantly. Every tremor, every suppressed memory, every glimmer of resistance. They called her results perfect, but they never smiled. That wasn't their role. Her success only meant she was ready for more pain. They began introducing real people into the tests. Political prisoners, failed acolytes, broken spies. They told her nothing about them, only this: extract truth or induce loyalty. She did both. Not by shouting, not by hurting, but by understanding exactly how a person breaks. Her gaze had become something else now, heavy, cold, surgical. She could look into someone's eyes and feel what they feared losing, then use it. Not for herself, for the Order. When she was allowed brief moments of silence, she began hearing something strange. Her own thoughts, not commands, not responses. Thoughts, not about escape, not about freedom, but about difference. Why did some fail while she remained? Why could she detach so easily? Was it the training? Or was something missing in her that the others still had? She didn't ask, not out loud. But her silence became sharper, her movements more deliberate. And when she was told to enter the ritual chamber alone, she didn't hesitate. There, she was instructed to kneel, to close her eyes, to repeat one phrase: "I am not the self, I am the function." She said it without feeling. And when she opened her eyes again, they didn't feel like hers. She didn't feel tired anymore, because something inside her had stopped sleeping entirely. A voice had grown, one that watched even when she rested. A voice without mercy. A voice that would soon be given a name. They summoned her at midnight. No alarm, no words, just the silent hiss of a door unlocking itself, and two masked figures waiting in the hall beyond. She followed without speaking. Her bare feet touched cold metal. The hallway was long, windowless, without signs or turns, only forward. She had walked these halls before, but this time was different. The lights were dimmed. The air held no scent of chemical cleaners or surgical steel. It smelled ancient, like dust on holocrons, like air that had been undisturbed for centuries and only now stirred to bear witness. They led her into a room that did not belong in this facility. Stone walls, red sigils, Sith texts arranged on pedestals too tall to reach. At the center stood a figure in crimson robes, his face masked in silver, his eyes hidden behind curved obsidian lenses. She didn't know his name. She didn't need to. He raised a hand, and the others left without a word. He spoke only once. "You have no past, but you will carry a legacy." From beneath his robes he produced a thin black band, smooth, seamless, inscribed with microscopic Sith glyphs. It pulsed with red light. As if alive, he placed it on the ground before her. "This," he said, "is not your reward. It is your burden. Speak your name. Speak what you will become. And if you lie, the Force will consume you." She did not flinch. She knelt before the band, not in reverence, in calculation. And then for the first time, she spoke a name. Not one she remembered. One she created. Maladi. The name echoed, soft but sharp. The band lifted on its own, floating to her forehead, then sliding around her scalp. It latched behind her skull. Pain followed, not searing, not overwhelming, but invasive, like something rewriting her. But she did not cry out. She did not move. Because it was done. There was no test after that, no explanation, no ceremony. She was escorted out, past the same halls, past the same chambers, but everything looked different now. Not because the rooms had changed, because she no longer belonged to them. She wasn't Set a student anymore. She wasn't Sit a subject. She was a voice. And that voice belonged to the Sith. They gave her assignments, real ones, agents to interrogate, technologies to corrupt, substances to engineer. She excelled not by imitating others, but by inventing what they hadn't considered. Her mind moved differently, not around problems, through them. Where others used the Force as a weapon, she used it as a solvent, dissolving resistance, memory, will. Darth Krayt noticed. She never met him directly, but she felt it. He began sending his inner circle to review her methods, to study her data, to test her theories, not for approval, for replication. Her existence became proof that pain could produce innovation. And she accepted that role. Because without it, she was nothing again. Soon she was moved to her own facility, a black tower buried beneath a forgotten moon in the outer rim. No sky above, no maps below, only corridors of her design, machines of her invention, and silence she controlled. From that silence, she built her own order, not of acolytes, but of chemicals, viruses, ideas. And from within that fortress, the galaxy would soon learn. Her mask was not to hide her identity. It was to replace it. Because Darth Maladi was not a woman. Not anymore. She was the function. The mind without a past. The voice that would rewrite the future. She never met him. Not face to face. Not truly. But she always felt his presence, watching through walls, through needles, through thoughts that weren't hers. Darth Krayt didn't need to be in the room to reshape a life. His influence seeped through orders, through tone, through the way her instructors flinched when speaking his name. After she took the name Maladi, everything changed. The silence she once moved through became targeted, focused. She wasn't one of many anymore. She was now one of few. They began isolating her again, not as punishment, but as privilege. Her chambers were moved to the outer sectors of the facility, cold, buried places with no other initiates. Her meals arrived through sealed doors. Her training came through hollow projectors. Her blood was drawn more often. Her thoughts were monitored more deeply. Because Darth Krayt had decided something. She was not meant to fight with sabers. She was meant to fight with sickness. In this new phase, combat drills were replaced with lab exposure. Meditation was replaced with molecular mapping. She studied not Jedi techniques but viral cycles, host response, neural decay, all through the lens of Sith belief that pain reveals truth, and truth is a weapon. She didn't resist this path. Why would she? It was just another layer of the same purpose. The only difference was the tools. Instead of mastering form vive, she mastered chemical dispersion patterns. Instead of perfecting force push, she perfected how to block neurotransmitters with nanoscopic enzymes. And when she succeeded, no one clapped, no one nodded. They simply assigned her a new subject. Sometimes it was a sample, sometimes it was a prisoner. She was told nothing about them. Age, species, history, irrelevant. Her job was to find the edge between life and suffering and hold it. The instructions were clear. Break them slowly. Watch what happens to the mind when the body forgets how to regulate itself. Document when the will to live begins to fray, and never interfere emotionally. She didn't step, but she remembered their eyes, not out of guilt, out of study. What did the eyes do at the final moment of surrender? Did they widen, narrow? Did they plead or flicker or go still? These were the kinds of questions she was rewarded for asking. And Darth Krayt was always watching. Not just through surveillance, through the Force. His presence wasn't like other Sith Lords. It wasn't fire or thunder. It was disease, heavy, internal, waiting. The instructors described it in whispers, a presence that infected loyalty rather than commanded it. He didn't need to speak to you. He lived inside the cracks of your fear. Maladi understood that, more than the others. Because she didn't fear Krayt the way they did, she understood him. She recognized that kind of design, to be broken open, rearranged, made to serve something higher. He wasn't their master because he was strong. He was their master because he rewrote their purpose. And now, he was rewriting hers. Her assignments grew more precise. They asked her to predict when a species would fail under pressure, which biological systems gave out first in different climates, how force sensitivity changed cellular regeneration. They weren't set preparing her for war. They were preparing her to design war. To create conflicts that didn't need armies, just viruses, ideas, and the right bodies to carry them. And even when she slept, she felt the eye watching. Not cruel, not kind, just present. Every decision she made, every subject she marked, every breath she drew in the lab, it all felt guided, as if her thoughts weren't entirely hers anymore. And she didn't mind. Because the deeper she went, the clearer her function became. She wasn't set here to win battles. She was here to make sure no one else could fight at all. The first time she touched raw Sith alchemy, she didn't understand what she was holding. It looked like ash, gray, formless. But when the vial opened, it pulsed, not with light, but with memory. Not hers, someone else's. A scream buried in the substance itself. The assistant who handed it to her backed away, just slightly. She didn't. Maladi didn't ask what it was. She didn't ask why it moved. She asked only what it could become. The Sith who oversaw this next phase of her training did not carry a lightsaber. He wore no armor. His hands were permanently stained, blackened by decades of exposure to alchemical agents that should have killed him long ago. They called him the Scholar. He called himself nothing, but he spoke to Maladi differently than the others. "You are not here to create pain," he told her. "You are here to make it last." She listened. Alchemy wasn't just science warped by the dark side. It was feeling reshaped into matter. Fear could be turned into fluid, hatred into gas, memory into metal. The Force wasn't a tool in these chambers, it was the canvas, and Maladi learned to paint with it. She began by cataloging failures, things other Sith had tried to make, things that lived too long or not long enough, parasites that fed on Force signatures, fungi that grew in the presence of hope, liquids that burned only when touched by a Jedi. They weren't legends to her, they were ingredients. And she wasn't afraid of them. Her first creation was simple, a nerve-dulling mist that traveled through the bloodstream and settled in the spine. It didn't kill, it simply muted motion, not entirely, just enough to break timing, coordination, memory of movement. When used on Force wielders, it didn't cut off their power. It made them clumsy, slow, like they were moving through a dream they couldn't wake from. It was approved within a day, and by the end of the week, already in testing. She was 15. The Scholar gave her access to deeper texts, not just recipes, but histories, accounts of Sith who had tried to remake life itself. Sorzu's Cine, Sado, Bane's transference attempts, the mistakes of Darth Plagueis, preserved in whispered retellings and shattered data fragments. She memorized everything, because the future wasn't going to be built with sabers. It was going to be grown, cell by cell, command by command. The more she learned, the less she slept, not because she was tired, because she wasn't. Her body adapted to the stimuli. Her mind adjusted to the presence of corrupted energy. Her breath changed. Her eyes adjusted to darkness faster. Her voice grew softer. She didn't feel like a Sith. She felt like something before names, before masks. There were moments, rare ones, where she would sit alone in her lab and feel something stir, not fear, not power, something quieter, a thread, a presence in her veins that wasn't entirely her. It didn't speak, but it hummed. She began experimenting on herself, small tests, inhalants, injections, neural blockers designed to suppress emotion. She wasn't seeking pain resistance. She was seeking silence, not absence, control, and it worked. She could lower her heartbeat, flatten her emotional response, enter rooms of suffering without being moved, interrogate without cruelty, experiment without distraction. Krayt noticed again, this time through silence. No orders, no praise, just a new facility, larger, deeper underground. Her own. There she was given access to prisoners, some captured Jedi, some not. No names, no rights, just bodies. She used them carefully, not to test power, but precision. What dose was too much? What image triggered resistance? What word planted doubt? And all the while her body adapted. So did her mind. Sith alchemy had left its mark, not through scars, but through stillness. She didn't feel like a girl anymore. She didn't feel like a Sith either. She felt like the thing they wanted her to become. And whatever that thing was, it no longer needed permission to continue. There was no light in the interrogation chamber, not because it was dark, but because the light had been engineered to flicker just below perception. A rhythmic pulse that made the subject's pupils contract at irregular intervals, enough to unsettle the brain, disrupt focus, erode confidence. Maladi designed that herself. She didn't need to shout, she didn't need to wound, she simply adjusted the variables, scent, sound, posture, silence, until the mind of the prisoner began to drift. It was never about breaking the body, it was about reprogramming thought. Her first subject was a former Imperial operative, Veteran, disciplined, injected with anti-interrogation training that blocked memory through pain thresholds, traditional methods failed. Even enhanced Sith persuasion had limits. But Maladi didn't use the Force like others. She used empathy. Not as compassion, as a weapon. She studied the way his fingers trembled when he thought of his squad. The way his tone changed when he spoke of failure. She let him believe he was winning. Let him believe silence gave him control, and when his guard dropped, not in panic but in fatigue, she spoke. Not to threaten, to ask. What was the last order you questioned? He blinked, hesitated, then answered. It wasn't said truth yet, but it was the beginning. That sense all she needed. Over time, she stopped thinking of them as captives, not because she respected them, but because they were irrelevant once the process began. Whether Jedi, officer, Sith traitor, or smuggler, every mind had loose edges. Her job was to find them. Her voice became one of her most effective tools. Low, unemotional, precise. When she spoke, it wasn't to convince, it was to guide the subject into the shape she needed. She mirrored tone, matched breathing, slipped questions into the spaces between answers. The goal wasn't to pull the truth out. It was to make them offer it willingly. One subject, a Jedi Knight captured during a failed skirmish on Dak, resisted for days, not violently. Quietly, she respected that, not as a peer, but as a pattern. He meditated in silence, blocked her presence, spoke only in mantras. She didn't force him to speak. She let the silence stretch for hours. Then she sat with him, breathed with him, matched the rhythm. And on the fifth day, when he opened his eyes and whispered, "Why?" she knew the door was open. He didn't survive the process, but that wasn't set failure. That was data. Each interrogation became more refined. She didn't just record words, she recorded facial twitches, breathing spikes, midi-chlorian response to emotional stimuli. Over time, she began developing profiles, not for individuals but for species, training backgrounds, belief systems. The Sith didn't see minds this way. She did. They used the Force to crush. She used it to seep, to infect. She didn't leave scars. She left silence. The kind that lingered long after the prisoner forgot what they'd said. But with each mind she reshaped, something shifted inside her. Not guilt, not doubt, just a growing space where her own memories used to live. She found herself pausing before sleep, not because she was afraid, but because she couldn't remember what her own voice used to sound like. Not the one she used in sessions, the real one, if it had ever existed. She didn't ask questions, she recorded results. But sometimes, between sessions, she stared at the glass reflection in the control room, not at her face, at her eyes, wondering if they still held anything that belonged to her, or if everything had become observation. And if that was the cost of mastery, she paid it, every time, without hesitation. Because the One Sith didn't need monsters. They needed minds sharper than pain. Her reports became shorter over time. Not because she grew careless, because fewer words were needed. Test Subject 11, compliant within 48 hours. Strain 7, latency confirmed, memory erosion sustained. Directive say outcome, successful misdirection, zero trace. Darth Krayt didn't ask questions. He never sent praise, but her assignments multiplied. The closer his war crept toward chaos, the more often her methods were requested, not on battlefields, in shadows, quiet, precise, systemic collapse. Maladi didn't crave visibility. She studied silence, refined it, weaponized it. She designed triggers no one would see, words encoded into diplomatic gestures, pheromone-based suggestions laced into food shipments, disrupted sleep patterns broadcast through embedded whole news cadence. not just to manipulate decisions, to rewrite patterns of thought. And the results spoke without speaking. Systems unraveled, alliances dissolved, trust turned into instinctive unease, and no one could explain why. Maladi didn't need them to understand. She needed them to forget what it felt like to believe in anything. She tested on herself again, this time not biologically, but neurologically, a prototype parasite meant to suppress self-doubt. She wanted to know what it would feel like to think without resistance. It worked for 3 days. Then the parasite adapted. It didn't suppress doubt. It removed consequence. She watched herself on the lab feed speaking aloud, offering instructions she didn't remember formulating. Precise, efficient, chilling. When she extracted it, the parasite was still alive, and it looked back at her. For a moment, she stared. Not in fear, in recognition. She stored it, labeled it as unstable, then sat in silence for an hour. She no longer labeled these reactions as feelings. They were signals, adjustments. Like any system, the self could be calibrated. By 20, she had surpassed the rank of scientist. She wasn't just a weapon. She was now part of the strategic mind behind the One Sith's hidden war. Not the loud one, of lightsabers and invasions. The quiet one, the one that left no bodies behind, only hesitation, only erosion. Darth Krayt began relying on her for more than execution. He asked for forecasts, hypotheses. How long could a population last under engineered famine? Could faith in the Jedi be reversed through generational trauma? What was the half-life of hope? She answered without delay. Not because she had the answers, because she knew how to find them. And still, she didn't feel power. She felt pressure. Like everything she had learned, endured, become, was part of some slow compression, folding her into a shape no one had yet named. Sometimes, after particularly successful operations, she returned to her private chamber, not to rest, but to sit, observe herself. One time, she removed her mask and looked at her reflection for 20 uninterrupted minutes. She expected to feel nothing. But what she felt was worse. She felt indifference. As if the face looking back didn't matter. As if it never had. There was no rebellion in her. No suppressed identity waiting to rise. Only the exact function the One Sith had designed. And because she felt nothing, she knew the work was succeeding. The best tools do not question their own usage, and Darth Maladi was a perfect tool. Silent, clean, forgettable. By the time her name reached the lips of the Jedi Council, it was already too late. She wasn't coming for them with blades. She was already inside their doubt. And by the time they realized what was happening, they wouldn't remember who taught them how to fear. There were no more orders now, no more instructors watching from the edges, no voices guiding her hand. Darth Maladi had become the one they feared, not through presence, but through precision. She sat at the center of her own network, buried within a fortress of labs and listening devices, surrounded by loyalists who dared not speak her name outside of encrypted code. There was no throne, no audience chamber, only screens, data streams, chemical inventories, and silence. She was the mind that watched everything. And yet in that silence, a strange thing began to happen. She started watching herself. Not through ego, through pattern. Every action she took was tracked, not by the order, but by herself. Every decision was reviewed, every memory backed up into encrypted holofiles, every reaction dissected. What triggered the moment of choice? Why did she pause before giving that order? Why did she look twice at a particular report, even though the information was sound? She told herself it was for security, for improvement, but the questions kept coming. Quiet, repetitive, deep. Not signs of rebellion, signs of awareness. She studied the minds of others for years. Now she turned that lens inward. She examined her own emotions the way she would study a subject under interrogation, with detached interest, not empathy. Her reflection wasn't a person, it was a source of data. Her voice logs showed tonal shifts when speaking of Krayt, subtle hesitations when referencing older files from her training years, small, almost imperceptible gaps in her reports. She deleted none of them. She catalogued them. If her mind was a tool, then it needed monitoring, calibration, redundancy, and if something was degrading, if her function was weakening, she would find it and correct it. She wasn't instead afraid of breaking. She was afraid of slipping without noticing. Control had become more than philosophy. It was survival, but even perfection comes with cost. Her most trusted subordinates began failing. Subtle errors, sloppy encryption, delays in toxin deployment. She replaced them without hesitation. No warnings, no conversations, just removals. And yet, each failure left a mark. Not on the mission, on her rhythm. She began waking early, earlier than programmed, sitting longer in analysis rooms, speaking less, not out of fatigue, out of calculation, because if the system could fail around her, then perhaps it could fail within her too. The force didn't sit help. It wasn't set quiet anymore. It buzzed around her, not with voices, not with warnings, but with presence, pressure. It didn't guide her hand like it did for Jedi. It questioned her, with feeling, not loud, but always there. She meditated to clear it, injected suppressants when it lingered, but the sensation remained. Like being watched, not by Krayt, not by spies, by something deeper. The memory of who she had been, back when her name was still an assignment. She erased the thought, trained harder, assigned herself new trials, sleepless runs of interrogation technique simulations, hours spent mapping hypothetical viral scenarios across sectors that weren't even active. She needed the silence back, because in that silence there was no reflection, no past, no resistance, only function. But every now and then, rarely, she would pass a mirrored panel or catch her image reflected in a console and pause. Her eyes had changed, not in color, in depth. They no longer watched others. They watched her, and that, more than anything, made her tighten the controls. Because if even her own gaze had become surveillance, then nothing inside her was private anymore. And she couldn't set afford to wonder who she was. Not when the galaxy had started wondering what she was. Loyalty had once been something tested. You gave someone an order. You watched if they obeyed. You punished when they didn't. That was the way of the Sith. Simple, crude, predictable. Maladi didn't believe in testing loyalty anymore. She believed in building it. From the inside. Not through fear, not through reward, through reconstruction. Her subjects no longer had secrets, they had fragments, memories she could isolate, emotions she could reroute. A history wasn't something someone lived, it was something that could be reprogrammed, slowly, carefully, through layers of confusion, repetition, and need. She started small. Jedi prisoners who refused to speak. Smugglers who claimed they didn't sit care. Sith defectors who thought ideology could outweigh survival. She didn't interrogate them. She didn't torture them. She asked questions. Simple ones. What planet did you first feel safe on? What sound does failure make in your dreams? When did you last believe in something that hurt you? Then, once the subject answered, sometimes truthfully, sometimes not, she began erasing. Not through chemicals, through suggestion. She'd speak to them while they slept, using subtle force pulses tied to memory triggers. She'd alter logs, change lighting, replay messages out of sequence. Within days, the subject wouldn't be sure which memory came first, or whether they had even made the choices they remembered. Then she offered them something new. Not freedom, purpose. Not the kind that came from ideology. The kind that came from silence, from relief, from letting go. And they took it. Because she was instead changing their minds. She was removing the parts of them that resisted. By the time they spoke her name, they did so willingly. They believed it had always been that way. Her greatest experiment lasted 26 days. A captured Jedi archivist, not a warrior, a thinker, quiet, focused, believed in the code, the history, the meaning behind symbols. By the end, he couldn't remember which temple he trained in. He didn't mourn it. He thanked her. The Sith above her thought it was mind control. It was instead. It was consent, engineered from absence. She began training others in this process, carefully, selectively. Her methods required detachment most Sith lacked. Rage had no place here, nor did dominance. Only calibration. She referred to it as loyalty imprinting, others called it rewriting, but to Maladi, it was simply clarity. She used it on agents, on diplomats, even on One Sith acolytes who showed too much ambition. No one questioned it, because her results were perfect. And perfect results silenced curiosity. But the more she refined the process, the more a question began to repeat itself in her mind. Could loyalty exist without programming? Could anyone truly choose devotion? She didn't ask this aloud. She barely asked it internally. But it stayed, like a whisper that didn't belong to her, echoing between tests, between simulations, when she watched her subjects smile and say her name as if they'd known her their whole lives. She reminded herself they were tools, outcomes, templates. But one night, while reviewing a session log, she paused. The subject, a former Sith scout, stared into the camera and whispered, "Thank you for saving me." And something in Maladi recoiled. Not in guilt, in confusion. She had never been thanked before. Not without programming. Not with that tone. The recording ended. She deleted nothing. But she played it again. Twice. 3 times. Then closed the file. She didn't sleep that night. Because if gratitude could emerge from manipulation, then maybe emotion wasn't as easily controlled as she believed. And if that was true, then somewhere, deep inside the mind she thought she had perfected, loyalty could still choose to leave. She learned early that the body remembers what the mind forgets. So when memory manipulation began to show cracks, when whispers of rebellion returned to reconditioned minds, Maladi turned to something older, something quieter, something permanent. She stopped asking her subjects what they believed. She changed what they were. It began with minor adjustments, neural implants to monitor stress before it reached awareness, subdermal tattoos laced with neuroblockers, voice modulations triggered by sound frequencies. These weren't punishments, they were reminders. Every part of the body became a message to the mind. You are not in control anymore. But control was never enough. She needed fear, not just from individuals, but from entire systems. Whole networks of resistance needed to see what happened when someone defied the One Sith. So she refined the art of symbolic reconstruction. The first subject was a former Jedi Knight captured on an Outer Rim listening post, defiant, silent. After weeks of psychological probing, she didn't speak, but Maladi wasn't listening for words anymore. She removed the Jedi Set's left hand, replaced it with an alchemically treated appendage, not mechanical, not organic, something in between. The tissue pulsed faintly. It moved on its own, in slight subconscious responses to force waves in the air. When the subject woke, she didn't scream. She stared. Not in pain, in disbelief. Her body had become a stranger to her, and her silence broke. Not into confession, into pleading. Maladi didn't punish her further. She didn't need to. She released her, let her walk back to the Jedi. And when she did, when they saw what she had become, the message carried more than words ever could. This is what happens when you resist the One Sith. You return, but not as yourself. Others followed. A bounty hunter's eyes removed and replaced with biologically reactive crystals that glowed in the presence of lies. A traitorous Sith agent returned with a spine that shimmered under starlight, revealing every implant they'd ever hidden. None of them died. That wasn't the point. Maladi wasn't making corpses. She was making symbols. In time, even Krayt's closest operatives began requesting her techniques, not for prisoners but for allies, to ensure loyalty, to ensure memory, to ensure identity was no longer a variable but a product. She didn't see it as cruelty. She saw it as continuity, because if the self could be altered to better serve the whole, wasn't that just evolution? Her labs changed to accommodate, no longer just testing chambers, operating rooms, observation theaters, tanks filled with fluid that adjusted tissue down to the cellular level. Sith alchemy met bioengineering, technology met instinct, and through it all, she remained still. She never raised her voice, never celebrated results, never mourned the ones who failed, because the body was just a page, and she had mastered how to write on it. But there were moments, brief ones, when she would watch her subjects sleep post-modification, breathing steady, eyes twitching beneath lids, minds lost in dreams that didn't belong to them anymore. And she would wonder, was this control? Or was it a kind of forgetting? Had she created loyalty? Or had she simply removed the ability to remember rebellion? She didn't seek the answer, but it lingered. Each time she looked at her own hands, steady, precise, unchanged for years, she remembered the title Krayt gave her. Intelligence. Not emotion, not war, just thought, weaponized. And now, physical. Because fear does not need volume. It only needs form. And Darth Maladi had made herself fluent in both. The Jedi Sept's name was Seren Null. She was captured during a failed diplomatic insertion on Bastion, young, quiet, calm. Maladi didn't request her, she didn't need to. The One Sith delivered captives like shipments now, categorized by rank, potential, and political value. But there was something different about this one. She didn't beg, didn't protest, didn't try to escape. She simply sat, watched, waited. Maladi recognized the posture immediately. Not defiance, not surrender, acceptance, the kind Jedi trained for, but rarely achieved. They began standard procedures: sleep disruption, identity fragmentation, memory loop induction. Her reaction was minimal. She responded with compassion when her captors spoke, even when they lied. She answered questions with questions, not to resist, to reflect. Most prisoners lasted 4 days before showing signs of breakdown. Seren lasted 16. By then, Maladi took over herself, not because the others failed, but because she was curious. What allowed this one to remain whole? She approached the session not as an adversary, but as a student. She asked Seren what she believed. The Jedi responded that pain passes, but kindness echoes. Maladi tilted her head, not at the answer, at the confidence. She adjusted the lighting, the pacing, the cadence of questions. Seren adjusted with her gently, unafraid. Each day Maladi increased the pressure, reduced sleep, introduced ethical distortions, scenarios designed to force failure. Still, Seren didn't collapse. She cried once. Not for herself, for a memory. A friend lost. Maladi recorded it carefully, slowed the footage, studied the change in her voice. But even in grief, Seren didn't bend. Maladi tried truth serum, then placebo. The results were identical. The data refused to deviate. And for the first time in years, Maladi paused not to observe, but to feel. She didn't know what it was. Not weakness, not frustration, but something close to recognition. Seren reminded her of something she couldn't quite name. The memory of a time when belief wasn't calculated, when purpose wasn't assigned. It was a dangerous thought, so she buried it and proceeded to the final phase. Identity override. A technique so refined it could convince the subject their own memories were false, that they were Sith all along, that the Jedi were the ones who lied. It worked on dozens before. But Seren resisted, not by fighting. By listening. She let the words wash over her. She welcomed the illusions. She acknowledged the questions. Then she said, "I hear you, but I know who I am." And that was it. Maladi watched the footage 12 times, ran neural scans, confirmed truth state readings. Seren had not resisted the programming. She had absorbed it and remained herself. That night, Maladi didn't just file a report. She didn't sleep. She simply sat, reviewing old interrogation footage, not of Seren, of herself. Moments from early sessions, when her voice still had uncertainty, when she still blinked too often, when she flinched, barely, at the cries of a prisoner. She compared that to now, and realized something. She didn't yet recognize herself anymore. She had succeeded in becoming the function, but somewhere in that process, the thread that connected her to choice had snapped. She wasn't set angry. She wasn't set sad. She was curious. What would it feel like to believe in something again? Not as a tool, not as a test, as truth. The next morning, she ordered Seren released. No explanation, no memory wipe. Let the Jedi walk free. Her subordinates were silent. No one questioned her. They had learned that lesson well. Maladi didn't document the decision, didn't archive it. Because something in her knew it wasn't part of the mission. It was something else. A fracture, a signal, or perhaps the first moment of her own interrogation beginning. And she didn't know if she wanted it to end. The facility had no designation. It wasn't listed on any manifest, no transport logs, no droid maintenance requests. It existed only through silence. Deep beneath the crust of a forgotten moon, past layers of shielding and signal scramblers, beyond the edge of where the galaxy still made maps. It was called the Womb. Not by Maladi, by the others, the few who knew it existed. To her, it was just where the work continued. Not the experiments they had trusted her with before, not the toxins, not the mind wipes, not the memory scripts. This was something older, something forbidden, even by Sith standards, not because it was dangerous, but because it asked a question no one wanted to answer. What happens when you touch the Force and poison it? Maladi had asked that question before, but this time, she didn't just ask it aloud. She asked it through design. The virus she built didn't begin as a weapon. It began as a theory, one she had held in private long before she told the Order. The Force, after all, was life. And like all living systems, it had patterns, cycles, weaknesses. Could it be disrupted, not blocked, not resisted, corrupted? Her first models failed. They killed too fast, overwhelmed the nervous system, reduced Force sensitives to static in a matter of hours. That was and set the goal. She didn't want to erase them. She wanted to twist them. To watch what happened when instinct betrayed ability, when presence became noise, when connection to the Force didn't vanish, it turned on the user. She called it Project Grey Ash, because it didn't set burn. It settled across the mind, across the cells, slowly. She didn't deform Krayt until the third stage. By then, the virus had stabilized, at least in theory. It was a hybrid of virology and alchemical imprinting, grown in fluid tanks lined with Sith glyphs. The virus responded to midichlorian density, not just in presence, but in motion. It listened to intention. It was, in a sense, alive. Maladi didn't flinch. She documented everything. She recorded how the virus whispered, not in words but in patterns. She noticed when its behavior changed based on emotion, when it grew more reactive around anger, when it retreated in the presence of guilt. It was reacting not to matter, but to meaning. She didn't report the detail. Not yet. Instead, she sealed the lab, dismissed the support staff, locked herself inside. Not because she feared sabotage, because she didn't trust anyone else to hear what she was starting to hear. The virus didn't speak, but its presence changed the room. She moved slower, her breathing softened. Even the machines began operating more quietly, as if the force itself inside the room didn't want to be heard. Her hands didn't shake, but her thoughts did. Not with fear, with awareness. There were no windows, no clocks, no connection to the outer war, no directives from Krayt, only work, only observation, only the quiet shifting rhythm of a thing that shouldn't exist. And for the first time in years, she wondered if she'd made something she didn't understand. But it didn't stop her. She fed it data, memory patterns from captured Jedi, force signature fluctuations from battlefield scans, meditation rhythms recorded from ancient Sith holocrons. And still, it responded. It adapted. It listened. It learned. She adjusted the lighting in the chamber, dimmer, more natural. She stopped wearing her gloves. She let it know her skin. And then, she cut herself. Just once, a clean line across her palm. She let the blood fall into the tank. The virus reacted instantly. Not with hostility, with stillness. Like it was considering something. She didn't move. Didn't hit record. Just stood there, waiting. The lights flickered once, and the hum of the machinery changed pitch. She logged it an hour later, but she didn't file it with the others. She marked it separately, buried in a locked directory she never labeled, because some things were not tests, they were moments. And this one had left something behind. Not on the skin, in the air, in the force, a sense that something was watching. But not from above, from within. And she wasn't so sure if it was the virus anymore, or herself. The dreams began 2 weeks later. Not sudden, not violent, just present. At first they came in fragments, a hand reaching toward her face, a voice calling her name, not Maladi, not the title, a name she didn't recognize, one she didn't think she had ever known. The first night, she ignored it. The second, she didn't sleep. By the third, she had modified the air system in the containment chamber to administer low-level neural suppressants during her rest cycle. It didn't help, because the dreams weren't set in her mind. They were in the walls. She began seeing places she'd never been, forests without names, temples without doors, her hands reaching towards stars through a window that didn't exist. Each vision was brief, glimpses, shadows, but every time she woke, her pulse was elevated. And every time she looked at the virus tank, the fluid inside was still. Still, but not asleep. She increased her testing routine, busied her thoughts, pushed her body past regulation, forced her attention to simulations, to structures, to detail. But whenever she paused, whenever she slowed, the dreams returned. Even with her eyes open, she saw the mask on the wall move, not physically, but subtly, as if something inside her questioned whether it had always belonged to her. She removed it only once during those weeks, stared at her own face in a polished tray of surgical instruments. It was pale, still, clean, but the eyes weren't hers. They were older, not by years, by memory. Like they remembered something she didn't something she had chosen to forget. She placed the mask back on and left the room. Didn't speak for 3 days. The virus readings remained stable, but she wasn't so sure about her own. One night, the dream changed. She stood in a corridor made of bone. The walls pulsed with a heartbeat that wasn't hers. At the far end, a child sat cross-legged, small, quiet, motionless. Maladi approached slowly. The child didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. And as she got closer, she saw the child was wearing her mask. Not holding it, wearing it. And beneath the mask, behind the eye slits, were her own eyes, awake, alert, and full of fear. She woke in silence, didn't scream, didn't move. She just sat up and stared at the wall for hours. She disabled the air system, shut down the suppressants. They weren't set working. She needed to hear the dreams now, not to understand them, to confront them, because they were no longer symptoms, they were messages. The next night she didn't sleep at all. She sat in the observation room and played her own training footage from years ago, footage she'd buried deep in encrypted archives, the early sessions, the first simulations. Her voice saying lines she didn't remember learning, her body reacting to commands she couldn't recall hearing. She watched herself grow, not with pride, with distance, like watching someone else's life. When the footage ended, she turned back to the virus. It floated, unchanged, contained, but something about it felt aware, as if it knew her better than she knew herself. She whispered something into the chamber. Not a command, a question. What was my name? No answer came. Only a shift in the lights, and a low pulse across the tank, subtle, like breath. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the silence to feel like memory, long enough to realize she no longer knew if she had invented the virus, or if the virus had been waiting to be found. The dreams continued. Now every time she closed her eyes, not visions, not messages, memories of nothing, of everything, of a girl she once was, or could have been, or might still be. If the work stopped, but the work could not stop, because if it did, then she would have to answer the question the virus kept asking. And she was no longer sure she wanted to know the answer. The breakthrough came during a containment breach, not from sabotage, from silence. The virus, stable for weeks, dormant in its chamber, began reacting without stimulus. No force sensitives present, no exposed DNA, no environmental change, and yet it moved, a slow spiral through the fluid, dense enough to distort the scanner grid. Maladi watched the display for hours. No spikes, no aggression, just motion, not random, deliberate. It was evolving. She didn't call for help, didn't dislodge the anomaly. She isolated the lab's neural surveillance system, rewired its parameters, shut down all secondary logs. For the first time in her career, she turned her own monitoring off. Because this wasn't set a test anymore. This was presence, and it was looking at her. The mask she wore, thin, dark, expressionless, began to feel heavier, not in weight, in purpose. It had always been a tool, an identity, a layer between herself and the world, but now it felt reversed. It wasn't protecting her, it was trapping her. She removed it slowly, feeling the pull of air against her skin as if for the first time. She set it down on the console, and for a while she simply breathed. It felt wrong. Not because of discomfort, because of vulnerability. She hadn't felt her own face in years, not truly. Her fingers traced the line of her cheekbone, the edge of her jaw. Each touch stirred something. A reminder that she was not born as Darth Maladi, that she had once been someone else. But who? And why did remembering feel like pain? She turned to the tank. The virus was still moving, slower now, not spiraling, mirroring. Its motion matched hers, beat for beat, a reflection not of form, but of thought. She leaned closer. Her breath fogged the glass, and the virus stopped. No movement, no ripple, total stillness. Like it was listening, waiting. She spoke aloud, not to the lab, not to herself, but to it. "What do you see in me?" There was no response, only a change in the air. She felt it, not through sound, but pressure, not around her, inside, like something had stirred and chosen not to speak. She stepped back, replaced the mask, and everything returned to normal. The scans leveled, the virus settled, the room cooled, but she knew what had changed. It wasn't Set, the experiment. It was her. She'd created something capable of sensing the Force, not as energy but as thought. And now it had sensed hers. It had touched her memories. Not the ones she remembered. The ones she buried. The ones that lived beneath the mask. She sat down and began writing the final sequence. The delivery model was ready. The weapon could now adapt to its host. Hide inside Force attunement. Whisper beneath awareness. Strike not at tissue but at meaning. She called it Phase 0, and she encrypted it with a biometric key. Only her neural signature could unlock it, because no one else should use this. No one else should even understand it. The weapon wasn't dangerous because it killed. It was dangerous because it knew you. And it knew her now. More deeply than anyone ever had. More than Krayt. More than the Order. Because it hadn't just read her reports, it had read her silence. And there, behind the mask, behind the calm and control, it had found something unspoken. Something human. And if it could see that, it could see anything. She stopped sleeping entirely. At first, it was unintentional. An hour lost here, a night skipped there. But soon it became ritual. Then necessity. She couldn't afford dreams anymore. Not when they felt more real than her waking life. Inside the womb, time lost shape. The lighting never changed. The air never shifted. Meals arrived by automation, untouched. Her body adapted, her senses narrowed. The hum of machines replaced the pulse of hours. She dismissed the last of her staff quietly. No warnings, no conflict, just security clearance revoked, permissions erased. When questioned by Krayt's council, she replied with a single line. This phase must remain undisturbed. No one challenged her. Not because they respected her, because they feared what she was building, and what she was becoming. The lab, once filled with screens and sound, fell into stillness. The only noise now was the gentle churn of the virus tank. Even that began to feel like breath, as if the entire room exhaled and inhaled through it. Maladi didn't monitor the virus anymore. She sat with it, sometimes for hours, sometimes longer. She watched it shift inside the fluid, its shape never stable, its rhythm eerily matched to her own thoughts. It didn't just reflect her presence now, it anticipated her. When she moved, it stirred. When she whispered, it pulsed. When she stared long enough, it paused. Not in reaction, in attention. It had learned her. Or perhaps she had taught it too well. She tried once more to finish the project. Seal it, store it, encode it in stasis. But the moment she began the shutdown protocol, her hand trembled. The system didn't yet register an error, but she did. Because in that moment, she wasn't sure if it was her decision, or the virus guiding her. She aborted the command, and sat back in her chair. Mask off, face expressionless. A part of her whispered, "You've gone too far." Another part answered, "This was the only way." She tried to remember the first day she arrived in the lab. the first code she entered, the first thought she had as the door sealed behind her. But there was nothing. Only the silence, only the cold, only the hum, and her breathing. Slower now, shallow. Not from weakness, from distance, as if the self was separating. As if she was becoming less of a person and more of a process. The force inside the lab no longer felt external. It was folded into the walls, the wiring, the fluid. It ran through her fingertips and echoed in the virus chamber like memory trapped in motion. One night, or what passed for night, she sat across from the tank and whispered, "Do you see me?" The virus didn't move. Not at first. Then, slowly, it divided. Split into two equal spirals, mirrored, balanced. It was the only time she recoiled, because the shape it made was one she remembered, from dreams, from before, from a place she couldn't name, a place she might have been. She stood slowly, backed away, not in fear, in awe. She sealed the chamber again, but this time, from the inside, locked every system, hardwired the neural gates, disconnected herself from the order, not as rebellion, as containment, because something inside her now felt open, and she couldn't risk it spreading. They would call it madness. They would say she lost her mind in pursuit of power. But that wasn't it. She hadn't lost her mind. She had heard it, speaking back to her for the first time, without programming, without design. And in that voice, she didn't hear Darth Maladi. She heard someone else, someone quieter, someone who had never been allowed to sleep. And now, in the deepest quiet of the One Sith's forgotten womb, she listened, because she knew what she had created could destroy the Force itself. And maybe, just maybe, it had already started with her. There were no ships, no sabers, no declarations of war. Darth Maladi didn't need them. While fleets maneuvered across systems and Jedi clashed with Sith on the front lines, her weapons traveled silently, inside data channels, encrypted memories, and whispered truths that no longer matched the records. She had learned long ago that truth was only dangerous when people still believed in it. And belief could be broken. She didn't falsify history, she bent it, slightly, gradually. Enough that even those who knew the past began to question their certainty. She changed timelines by minutes, orders by one word, biographies by a single choice. Then she waited. The victims did the rest. An admiral who once held loyalty above all started to doubt his command. A Jedi Knight remembered training under a master who had never existed. A Republic senator hesitated before casting a vote he once believed in. She never touched them. She didn't need to. Her algorithms did the work, seeded across compromised networks, built into non-lethal viruses that carried memory fragments in their wake. They didn't destroy the system, they rewrote its reference points. Truth didn't have to be defeated. It just had to be diluted. She tested it first on captured officers, not to see if they'd confess, but to observe how long it took for them to misremember. It started with names, then places, then missions, and eventually motives. One captain from the Outer Rim swore he'd defected willingly. He hadn't said. But after only 2 cycles of exposure, he believed it. He even thanked her for the clarity. She filed the report without comment. No emotion, just confirmation. That belief was not permanent, and memory was the most fragile battlefield of all. She deployed this strategy on larger scales. Entire sectors began to forget who issued the first strike. Holonet broadcasts shifted timelines. Archive entries rearranged themselves. Jedi holocrons showed inconsistent messages, not because of sabotage, because of pattern. The Force itself began to hum with contradiction, not loud enough to alarm, just enough to confuse. The Jedi felt it, but they couldn't set explain it. The Empire noticed it, but couldn't set trace it. Only the One Sith knew where it came from. And only Maladi knew how far it could go. She wasn't set destroying institutions. She was breaking trust. One whisper at a time. She reactivated old war files and let them leak into Republic channels. Not classified secrets, just doubts, rumors, stories about Jedi cruelty during the Clone Wars, about Sith redemption buried in ancient conflicts, about leaders who weren't what they claimed to be. She didn't just need to prove them. She only needed someone to believe they might be true. And once that seed was planted, it grew faster than any virus. She monitored the results from afar, from silent outposts, from labs deep in blacklisted sectors. No blood spilled, no casualties counted, but the effects were visible. Missions failed before they began. Alliances dissolved under mutual suspicion. Jedi refused to work alongside Jedi. And somewhere beneath it all, Maladi watched the galaxy rot from within. It wasn't swift revenge. It wasn't set doctrine. It was structure reduced to suggestion. And suggestion, when left alone, becomes truth. Her war left no craters, no ruins, only pauses, hesitations. And those were enough, because hesitation is the beginning of collapse. And collapse doesn't announce itself. It arrives like breath, like thought, like doubt. Corruption had always been seen as decay, rust, weakness. But to Maladi, it was something else. It was elegance. She didn't send agents to bribe senators or assassinate generals. She sent questions, untraceable data packets, edited broadcasts, journal entries slightly altered. And when those weren't enough, she activated something even more effective: trust. Because trust, once gained, never needed to ask permission again. She embedded her influence through people the galaxy already believed: a Jedi archivist with a perfect record, a Clone Wars veteran turned liaison, a Bothan operative trusted by half the mid-rim. None of them knew they served her. She didn't control their actions. She shaped the framework of their choices. A data terminal that slowed at the right time. A delayed communication. A thought implanted weeks earlier, barely noticeable, that surfaced during a crucial vote. These weren't set orders. They were conditions. And within those conditions, she built inevitability. Maladi's reach extended across all sides. She corrupted Sith politics without a word, slipped out into Jedi meditations, disrupted Republic chain of command protocols from abandoned satellites orbiting dead moons. She didn't need to win arguments. She needed people to hesitate long enough to lose their own. Even her own side wasn't set exempt. One Sith agents who grew too ambitious found their memories rewritten, not wiped but adjusted. They believed they had made certain decisions, believed they had earned certain titles, and by the time they acted on those false convictions, they exposed themselves. She didn't punish them, she observed. Because even failure had data. One of her most effective experiments was simple. She created a personality fragment, a harmless HoloNet columnist with a mild following. No politics, no power, just a voice. Every week, the column released innocuous thoughts, reflections on Jedi philosophy, skepticism about war tactics, minor corrections to official reports. Nothing extreme. Nothing that would spark outrage. But over time, people started to listen. And then they started to quote. Maladi never mentioned the column in her reports. Because the column wasn't set the weapon, the people repeating it were. By the third year, its phrases had reached military briefings. Jedi Knights cited it in debates. Sith operatives referenced it in recruiting materials, not knowing it came from the same hand. This wasn't Sith corruption. This was momentum. And momentum doesn't require force. It requires gravity. She built networks of soft gravity, pulling ideas slowly, silently, until beliefs bent in her direction without knowing why. She corrupted memories, corrupted timelines, but more than that, she corrupted identity. She knew that the more someone asked, "Is this real?" the more they stopped asking why they believed anything at all. And that was when control became permanent. Because people who no longer trust themselves don't just resist anyone else. She tracked these shifts like a scientist tracks temperature. Small variations, a degree here, a hesitation there, until the climate had changed entirely and no one remembered what warmth used to feel like. That was the war she waged. Not for planets, not for systems, but for certainty. And when certainty falls, nothing needs to be conquered. It just waits to be claimed. Under Maladi's eye, everything had become precise. Patterns obeyed. Agents responded. Messages delivered themselves across black market bandwidths and encrypted nodes, timed to seconds, formatted to her silent protocols. But then, one didn't dart. A report from Moonialinst arrived 3 minutes early. That shouldn't have mattered, but it did, because the agent who sent it had never sent anything early before. She checked the metadata. Correct ID, correct signal, correct encryption. But the language was wrong. Not flawed, not suspicious, just off. The phrasing carried a warmth that agent never used, and one sentence, a harmless observation about a market stall, matched a personal memory Maladi had never implanted, yet one she remembered. Her own. She dismissed it once. Then it happened again. A Sith liaison named Viden responded with confirmation to an order she never gave. He insisted she had. The system logs backed him. But Maladi hadn't stiped it. She hadn't even opened that channel. Her fingers hovered over the controls. She pulled the memory logs of her own mind. They were blank. She reran the surveillance recordings of her control room. Everything was normal. Too normal. The footage didn't freeze, didn't skip, but the body on screen, her body never blinked for 5 straight minutes. She hadn't moved at all. Like the footage was mimicking her, not recording her. Whispers reached her from the lower levels, silent screams during sleep cycles. A junior analyst heard his own voice, answering questions he'd never been asked. Another described a conversation he had with Maladi while she was off-world. She hadn't spoken to him, but he repeated her words, line for line. Then came the files. Archives she never accessed began showing new content. Research she hadn't yet approved. Experiments in hybrid neural mimicry, fusing force suggestion with viral coding. She tried to delete them. They reappeared. Not restored, rewritten. More accurate than her own drafts. As if something knew what she meant better than she did. She ran diagnostic purges on the entire facility. But even the purge logs were altered. In her dreams, she began speaking in voices not her own. Sometimes she woke up mid-sentence, reciting names from other lives, Jedi names, Sith names, names she once erased. One day she found a note on her workstation, written in her hand, but not her thoughts. It read, "What happens when memory becomes more real than experience?" And below that, "You already know." Her heartbeat didn't rise. She didn't sweat. Because Maladi didn't respond with emotion. She responded with process. She isolated the system clusters, air-gapped entire wings of the facility, shut down every droid she hadn't set and built herself. She even moved operations into a lower vault, a lab disconnected from every known network. Still, the lights flickered when she thought of certain memories. Still, she found herself logging reports twice. One with edits she remembered, one untouched by her. but both signed with her ID. She no longer trusted her access codes, no longer trusted her hands, and in a final experiment she left a trap, a forged memory of an event that never happened, designed to replicate across her data networks. It should have remained dormant unless something else tried to retrieve it. 2 days later, it had spread to every console. But now it was more than a memory. It was a file, annotated, corrected, improved, by someone, or something. She had spent years weaponizing thought, and now thought itself, had turned against her. She stood in front of the central archive, motionless, staring at the terminal screen as if it might blink first. The file hovered there, not hidden, not protected, just open. It was her voice, her face, her orders, a list of names, Jedi, senators, Sith, all marked for removal. She recognized every name, remembered each mission, each death, each disappearance. But she didn't remember making the list. The timestamp showed it was compiled during a session she never logged. The system said it was her. She listened to the voice recording. It was her voice, but the rhythm felt wrong, too calm, too smooth, like a version of herself she'd intended to be, not the one she actually was. She ran a vocal stress analysis. No deception. Ran a neural comparison. Perfect match. Ran an emotion profile. No results. The voice was blank. Not even Sith discipline could make a signature that clean. Which meant it wasn't emotionless. It was manufactured. She turned to one of her own surveillance droids, gave it a test command, a standard protocol reset. It stared at her, did nothing. She repeated the command in an older dialect, still nothing. It didn't attack, didn't flee, just watched her. And in its reflection she saw something familiar. Her posture, her stillness, the exact angle of her shoulders, mirrored, copied. She shut it down manually, took the casing apart. Inside, nothing had changed. But etched into the inner panel was a phrase, "The shadow learns from the light." She hadn't programmed that. She hadn't said it. But she remembered thinking it, years ago, during an interrogation of a Jedi spy. That memory had never been uploaded, never recorded, only felt. And now, it was printed inside a machine. She began questioning her own flesh, her scars, her reflexes, her pain. Were they hers? Had they ever been? Did she create this system to control others? Or did the system create her to control herself? She tried to trace the infection, tried to isolate its source. But the truth was older than the first anomaly. Older than her appointment to Sith intelligence. Maybe older than her mask. Maybe even before she chose the Sith. Because that was the one choice she could never quite remember making. It was always said that the dark side seduced, but Maladi wasn't said seduced. She was shaped. Every decision had felt natural, logical, predetermined. She once believed that was clarity. Now she feared it was programming. One night, or what passed for night in the underground facility, she sealed herself in the lab vault. No communication, no power grid. Only raw air and steel walls. She took no tools, no data pads, just silence. She sat still for 10 hours, listened, not to machines, not to spies, but to herself. And in that stillness, a voice came, not external, not artificial, her own. The voice said, "You were not built to win. You were built to serve what wins." She didn't react, didn't speak. Because for the first time, she didn't know whether that voice was prophecy or memory. She returned to the surface days later. The facility was quiet, the files undisturbed, the agents normal, as if nothing had happened. as if she had imagined the war behind her eyes. But when she looked in the mirror, the reflection blinked before she did, and she knew the war on thought was over. She had lost. He should have stayed dead. That thought, more than once, had passed through Maladi's mind, even as she injected his body with compounds not meant for life, even as she watched Krayt's flesh boil and reconstitute under her careful designs, even as the stench of rot never left the chambers where he rested. When Darth Krayt returned from the brink, no celebration followed. There was no victory, only silence. A different kind of silence. Heavy, expectant, as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath, unsure whether to welcome back a tyrant or bury him again. Maladi knew something had changed. He spoke in the same voice, issued the same commands, but the eyes were different. The hatred had grown sharper, yes, but so had the fear. And it wasn't fear of the Jedi. It wasn't fear of the Galactic Alliance. It was something older, something she couldn't name. He had seen something while gone, and he refused to speak of it. The Order obeyed as it always had, but loyalty thinned, whisper by whisper. Acolytes bowed lower, but lingered less. Lords carried out assignments, but no longer returned to report. Some vanished without a word. Others reappeared with answers to questions they had not been asked. Maladi did not report this decay. She documented it. She watched Darth Nihil rise too quickly. She saw Darth Maladi hesitate in the shadows, and she noticed how Krayt stopped addressing them by title. He called them you, no longer Lord, no longer Sith, just you. It was the tone of a man who had walked through death and come back afraid of his own reflection. For Maladi, the shift was not a surprise. The One Sith had always been brittle. It was built on Krayt's vision, but his vision demanded unity, submission, silence. It left no space for ambition, no permission for doubt, no margin for error. And that kind of silence eventually collapses under the weight of thinking minds. So when the cracks came, Maladi didn't flinch. She didn't try to fix what was breaking. She sharpened her scalpel. When Krayt was ambushed and left to die once more, this time not in secret but in open betrayal, Maladi knew the time had come. She didn't join the chaos. She didn't fight for control. She returned to her labs, sealed the doors, and vanished from the war entirely. Let them tear each other apart. Let the blood wash the slate clean. She had other plans, but there was still the body. Krayt's body. Or what remained of it. Maladi never confirmed if it was his, never dared to probe deep enough to know for sure. Perhaps part of her didn't want to know. Perhaps the corpse was only symbolic, a reminder. She preserved it anyway. Encased in layers of fluid and technology, it sat suspended in her most secret chamber, silent, decaying, refusing to vanish. Sometimes she stood before it and asked questions. Not aloud, never aloud. But the questions were there. Why did he return? What did he see in death? Why did he come back, afraid? And most of all, what did he leave behind inside her? The One Sith, once held together by a singular purpose, had shattered into rival clans, lone hunters, secret enclaves hiding in forgotten corners of the galaxy. But Maladi, she didn't scatter, she didn't run. She went underground. Not to survive, to build. And as Krayt's body slowly dissolved behind sealed durasteel, Maladi turned her back on the war, on the Sith, on everything. Except the science. She didn't just need an empire. She needed time. The first to find her wasn't an enemy, it was a message. Encrypted, old Sith code, embedded in a memory crystal, left at the edge of her last known perimeter. She almost didn't check it, but something in the pattern, it was familiar, not in content, in rhythm, like a voice she hadn't heard in years, now humming behind static. The crystal played a single phrase. Not a name, not a warning, just this. We speak in flesh now. Maladi sat with those words longer than she meant to, days maybe. She didn't eat, she didn't sleep. Her mind circled the phrase like a hound on a scent trail. She knew who sent it, Darth Havoc. But Havoc was dead. Or he should have been. That phrase, "we speak in flesh," had been theirs, a private heresy, back when they both served Krayt with blind loyalty, before he was broken, before she was broken. They experimented with neural echo implants, ways to bend thought, erase memory, build loyalty through direct organ manipulation. It was cruel science. Maladi had once called it teaching the body to think. Havoc took it further. He wanted to speak through the nervous system itself, no language, no code, just pain and instinct rewired into obedience. Maladi ended the project before it reached the field, or so she thought. But now the phrase had returned, and that meant the project had not died. She followed the signal, not physically, she would never risk herself, but with probes, encrypted droids, shrouded AI crawlers. It took months. She had to breach half a dozen dead systems and trace disappearing nodes across old Imperial networks. She found him on the fourth planet of a system that hadn't been charted since the Clone Wars. The facility wasn't hidden, it was just forgotten. Inside, the walls pulsed. Not lights, flesh. Something had built itself into the structure. Nerve fibers ran along support beams, veins replaced conduit cables, no droid surveillance, no visible defenses, only silence, the same heavy silence Krayt once carried in his voice. Her remote feed showed a single figure walking those halls, no longer armored, no longer human in posture, Havoc, or what remained of him. She didn't send a message. She didn't try to connect. She just watched. And she understood. He had finished what they started, but not for power, not for war, for purity. Havoc had turned the teachings into a living cathedral, one that didn't speak in words, one that didn't tolerate doubt. He had become the message. And that terrified her. Because if he could do it, others could too. The fall of Krayt didn't end the One Sith, it infected them. Each survivor carried a different fragment of the dream. Some became warlords, others went silent, slipping between sectors, building private followings. Each one thought they were the new prophet, each one called themselves the future. None of them realized what they were spreading. Maladi did. And that's when she began building something different. Not a faction, not a successor order, a solution. She began mapping the psychological profiles of every known Sith survivor, not their power levels, their trauma, their triggers, their obsessions, their breakpoints. She wanted to understand what the dream had done to them, what Krayt's vision had seeded in each of their minds. What she found disturbed her. They weren't set rebuilding. They were infecting, not with weapons, with ideas, and not new ones. The same old lie, wearing different names. Unity, strength, destiny. It always began with a whisper. Maladi had heard it before, and she was not going to let it grow again. She moved her work deeper. Not just underground, not just off-grid. She severed the last of her surveillance relays, torched the backup AI nodes, wiped the droid brains that used to manage her supplies. Everything that could observe her, gone. The lab became a void. No data went in, no signal came out. Only then did she feel safe enough to begin again. This time, she wouldn't build for Krayt, not for the Empire, not even for herself. She would build for extinction. Not of a species, of an idea. The One Sith had become a disease, not in body, but in belief. She had seen it grow like a tumor across time. It didn't matter if they wore armor or cloaks. It didn't matter if they bowed or rebelled. The core always returned. One will, one order, one future. She wanted to cauterize that dream. Her tools were not elegant, they were old, brutal, barely stable. Biotech she had hidden even from Krayt, neural toxins that didn't kill, they erased. Voice-triggered plague spores, inhalants that rewrote memory through scent. She didn't test them on prisoners, she didn't need to. She tested them on herself. Just enough to feel the shape of the damage, just enough to know what to improve. There were days she woke up and didn't remember what species she was. Other days her reflection looked like a stranger, not disfigured, just unfamiliar, like the face had been painted over too many times. And still, she kept going. The worst moment came quietly. She was cataloging notes on an experiment, a gas-based neurodisruptor meant to sever the connection between long-term identity and spoken language. In theory, it would make a Sith Lord forget their own name every time they tried to speak it aloud. But as she reviewed her logs, she noticed something wrong. The voice in the audio playback wasn't hers. Same tone, same cadence, but the phrasing off. It spoke like someone imitating her. It hesitated before pronouncing certain words. It used a sentence structure she'd stopped using years ago. She ran a biometric check. The vocal signature was identical. It was her voice, but not her. She listened to hours of recordings. All of them were wrong. Somewhere along the line, her own voice had become foreign. That was the moment she knew the lab wasn't a place anymore. It had become her. Every idea she killed, every weapon she created, every line of code, every petri dish, every whisper between her own ears. She wasn't instead building weapons against the One Sith. She was becoming one. Not in title, in function. The same way Krayt had. She had no name anymore, no rank, no followers, no purpose but this, to ensure the One Sith never returned. Even if it meant becoming their final memory. Even if it meant she would not survive what she was making. She took one last inventory. 10 airborne strains. 4 tactile delivery viral worms. A blood-borne symbiont that learned to host secrets by infecting the hippocampus, then detonated the memory center with a single spoken word. A synthetic foresight disruptor that caused prolonged visions of extinction whenever a Sith tried to use precognition. And at the center of it all, a seed. Not biological, not technological, just an idea. That none of them were necessary. That none of their visions would matter. That their future, the one future, was already burning. She whispered it to herself in the dark. This is the last prophecy. There will be no unity, no voice, no new age, only silence. She didn't write it down. She didn't encode it. She just spoke it once, then built the final vial. The one she would never use unless they returned. Her final creation had no name. She refused to give it one. Because names could be remembered, repeated, worshipped. And that was the root of the infection. She made it small, smaller than a breath. A fragment of synthetic DNA housed inside a brittle shard of artificial kyber, cold-forged, memory blank, force deaf. It couldn't be felt through the Force, couldn't be tracked, couldn't be influenced. To the Jedi, it would seem inert. To the Sith, it would feel like failure. But to her, it was perfect. It didn't kill, it didn't infect, it didn't do anything. Until someone tried to lead. That was its trigger. Not aggression, not emotion, not even power. The moment a Force-sensitive mind tried to dominate others, to unify them under one voice, it would begin. The decay would be slow. Speech would turn vague. Vision would turn to static. Memories would bleed together. Ambition would survive, but only as a whisper. And the more one tried to force it into clarity, the more one tried to lead, the more it would dissolve. Until nothing was left but the instinct to obey. Not her, not anyone, just obedience, blind, directionless, eternal. She had made the final Sith legacy, the death of control. No more empires, no more orders, no more one. The lab didn't explode. She didn't erase it. She simply walked out one day and never returned. She left no trail, no beacon, no message. The only thing she carried was the shard. She placed it inside a carbonite casing, buried it beneath the ruins of a crashed Jedi shuttle no one had visited in decades, and sealed it with a voice print that no longer existed, hers. Not the Maladi who had served Krayt, not the Maladi who had built weapons for mines, but the Maladi who had forgotten even her own face. She didn't wait for applause. She didn't wait for the Sith to rise again. She simply disappeared, and the galaxy forgot her, but not the echo of what she made. Years later, when rumors returned of hidden Sith gathering again, of Darth Krayts whispered across shattered worlds, some began to search for her. They thought they could bring her back, use her wisdom, revive her arsenal. None of them returned. No one knows if they found the lab, or if they found her, or if she had become something else entirely. But every now and then across certain sectors of space, where new Sith cults try to unite, where one voice tries to rise above the rest, something begins to fail. Commands go unheard. Visions stop mid-sentence. Leaders forget their names. And sometimes, the stars feel quieter than they should. She left no monument, no doctrine, no prophecy, just the design, the last defense, the extinction of the One. She didn't offer it because she believed in Wylock, she offered it because she didn't. The moment Darth Krayt vanished, the fractures in the One Sith spread fast. Wylock stepped forward like a shadow assuming form, claiming stewardship, power, and destiny. But Maladi had always seen the difference between authority and depth. He could speak Krayt's words, he could recite Sith doctrine, but he could not feel what Krayt felt that made him dangerous. So she gave him a gift. Not a weapon, not at first glance, not even something a Sith would recognize as power. It was a small black vial, no larger than her thumb, filled with something beyond comprehension. She didn't tell him what it did. She told him what it meant: influence, domination, victory without blood. Wylock studied it, considered it. He smiled. She smiled back. But the moment he left her presence, she activated the command code woven into its shell, a molecular lock, invisible, untraceable, irreversible. If Wylock tried to use it, it would backfire, not kill, but fail, confuse, delay. The kind of failure that doesn't appear right away, but waits, like rot beneath the surface. Because Maladi no longer wanted to win battles, she wanted to win time. Where Thiclark never questioned her sincerity. He saw what he wanted, a subordinate still loyal to the legacy of Krayt. But Maladi had not been loyal to Krayt. She had been loyal to the plan, and the plan was dead. Now she moved without a plan. The weapon, the real one, wasn't in the vial, it was in her mind. A virus shaped not to destroy bodies, but decisions, doubt, madness. A screen without sound. She called it a thought bomb, but it was no explosion. It was a quiet eclipse, a collapse from within. And she was still shaping it. Every night, alone in the underground reaches of her lab, she tested variables. Sith meditation melded with Yuuzhan Vong biotech. Jedi holocrons stolen from fallen temples, dissected for secrets of cognitive fracture. Genetic maps rearranged into spirals of code that whispered things even she didn't fully understand. Not every prototype lived long. Some attacked her, others melted into the floor. One simply looked at her and began weeping until it stopped breathing. But she kept going. Not because she wanted a perfect weapon, but because she wanted to know if it could be done. The Sith had always focused on strength, on conquest, but Maladi had begun to question something deeper. What if power wasn't about taking control, but making others give it up willingly? What if submission could be engineered? The vial she gave Wirelock was a seed, but the roots were already growing elsewhere. She no longer told her apprentices what she was building. She stopped referring to it by name. It changed every week anyway. Some days she thought of it as a cure, not for disease, but for identity. Other days it felt like revenge in liquid form. No matter what she called it, the idea stayed the same. A weapon that didn't destroy the enemy, it erased their will to fight. She never said it out loud, but in the silence of her lab, she knew one truth with absolute certainty. This wasn't for the Jedi. This wasn't even for the Sith. It was for the future. Maladi did not work with assistants anymore. Every time someone entered her lab, something changed. A breath too loud, a footstep misplaced, a question asked at the wrong time. Even silence became invasive, so she locked the doors and deactivated the hall monitors. Whatever she did now, she did alone. Her laboratory had once been a clean, clinical place, full of surgical light and pristine metal. But over the years, it had transformed. Von growths curled along the walls, alive but obedient. The air was thick with spores designed to filter toxins. The floor pulsed underfoot like a distant heartbeat. And on every surface, half-built experiments waited in glass chambers, twitching. She didn't speak to them. She observed, adjusted, waited. The new virus was no longer viral in the traditional sense. It was more like a psychic parasite, a carrier of suggestion, not sickness. Once inside the bloodstream, it didn't attack cells. It waited, watched, learned, and then rewrote. But rewriting thoughts was not like rewriting genes. DNA followed patterns, minds didn't. So Maladi studied failure like it was scripture. Test subjects, mostly captured agents or cloned templates, were exposed to the compound in controlled settings. The reactions varied wildly. Some collapsed immediately, overwhelmed by emotion. Others became passive, quiet, obedient. But the worst ones didn't change at all. They smiled, talked, walked, until one day they stopped responding. Not dead, not alive, just unreachable. She began cataloging responses into categories: disintegration, sedation, vacancy. Each type gave her a clue about how willpower defended itself, how identity resisted being undone. And slowly she started to find cracks. One batch produced hallucinations so vivid that the subject forgot where they were. Another induced guilt, deep, overwhelming guilt, for events the subject never lived through. One subject begged forgiveness for things they hadn't done. Another lost their name and couldn't find it again. But even these results weren't enough. Maladi didn't want chaos. She wanted control. True control. So she turned inward. Using a modified neuroscanner, she mapped her own mental responses to the compound in simulation. She recorded the emotional spikes, the hidden fears, the buried memories it dragged forward. One vision repeated more than any other: Krayt, dying, burning and staring at her. Not with betrayal, but with disappointment. She erased that data twice. It returned both times. The virus had no soul, but it recognized where to strike. In time, she learned to neutralize certain effects. She could cancel the hallucinations, narrow the emotional range, filter the delusions, and then she began shaping what remained into something else. Not random, not wild, but targeted, like a whisper aimed at the back of the mind, like the first crack in a dam. The first prototype that obeyed her design did something strange. The subject, a failed Sith hopeful with fractured loyalty, stood up, stared at her, and said, "There is no point." He then walked to the edge of the testing chamber, sat down and closed his eyes. He never moved again. Maladi recorded the timestamp, not as a failure, but as a beginning. Because for the first time, the weapon didn't destroy the body, it didn't shatter the mind. It simply broke belief. And that, she realized, was more dangerous than anything the Sith had ever built. He was never meant to arrive. Cade Skywalker wasn't part of the plan. Not directly, not in the form she encountered him. She had studied him, of course, monitored every whisper about his lineage, the child of Cole Skywalker, the one who survived Ossus, the one who walked away from the Jedi and didn't look back. He was a contradiction wrapped in pain, a living scar that refused to close. And for that reason, he became the perfect variable. When he entered her facility, bloodied, hunted, unstable, she didn't stop him. She welcomed him, quietly, cautiously, with the restraint of someone who knew what monsters could look like before they transformed. Cade didn't ask questions. He demanded results. He wanted his friend saved. He wanted control over his powers. He wanted everything the Jedi denied him and the Sith could not give. She gave him everything, just enough. They sat in silence as the machines worked. Maladi ran her tests while Cade looked away. The air between them was not trust. It was something else, recognition. She saw in him what she had seen in herself, someone broken in ways that could not be repaired, only directed. So she tested him. Not openly, not with syringes or needles, but with words, with the way she explained the procedure, with the phrasing she chose, with the doubts she planted. She wanted to see if her creation could crack someone like Cade. But Cade wasn't set like her test subjects. He was volatile, yes, reckless, brutal, but underneath all of it, he had an instinct she couldn't replicate. Something old, something Jedi, and something she feared: the capacity to choose. When she showed him the virus, explained what it could do, what it could mean, he didn't hesitate. He understood its weight, its danger, its temptation. And then he walked away. Not because he was strong, but because he didn't yet want to be like her. She watched him go, not with anger, not even with disappointment, with curiosity. Because in that moment Maladi faced something she had never accounted for, a mind that could look into darkness, understand it, and still step away, not out of fear, but conviction. And that, more than any hallucination or mental fracture, was the outcome she hadn't prepared for. Cade's presence had activated something in her, not guilt, not grief, but a question. Why did she let him leave? The weapon was ready, he was vulnerable, she could have stopped him. But she didn't set, and she couldn't explain why. Not to herself, not to the voices in her memory, not to the ghost of Krayt, who she imagined still lingered behind every shadowed corner of her lab. She had begun to wonder if the virus was meant for others at all, or if it was always meant for her. Maladi had always believed loyalty was a tool, not a virtue, not a promise, just a sharp edge you pressed into others to see how much they'd bleed. She had bled for Krayt, for the One Sith, for the illusion of structure that once wrapped around her like armor. But that armor was gone, shattered by betrayal, war, and time. And what remained underneath wasn't allegiance, it was doubt. She returned to her lab, but the silence had changed. It wasn't comforting anymore. It accused her. Every console, every tank, every unfinished prototype felt like a conversation she didn't want to finish. The virus was complete. It didn't just break the body, it eroded clarity. It turned hope into paranoia. And once unleashed, it couldn't be undone. That was the point. Wyalok wanted to deploy it, use it as leverage, a final weapon to control the Senate, the Jedi, the rest of the galaxy. Maladi handed it over. She even smiled when she did. But inside, she sabotaged it. Subtly, elegantly. Enough to ruin the control protocols without altering the structure. Enough to make it seem like a failure of delivery rather than design. She wanted it to fail. She wanted him to think she'd lost her edge, not her intent. And he never saw it. That was when she knew her place was no longer among them. The Sith had become what they claimed to despise, bureaucrats of fear feeding on repetition. There was no vision anymore, just survival, just noise. Maladi disappeared. No announcements, no confrontation, just absence. She retreated further into the Outer Rim, into ruins that predated both Jedi and Sith. There, among broken monuments and forgotten symbols, she built something new. Not a temple, not a weapon, a threshold. A place where she could sit with the version of herself that still believed in purpose. She didn't erase her teachings, she didn't renounce the dark side, but she began questioning the shape it had taken. She reviewed her experiments, not to refine them, but to understand the damage they had caused, not to others, to her. She remembered her early years, her laughter, the rhythm of the Massassi language on Korriban. She remembered the sharp pain of transformation, the heat of self-sacrifice, the first time she told herself that pain meant strength. And she wondered, had she ever believed that, or had she simply needed it to be true? When the news came that Wyalok had fallen, that Krayt had returned, that the Empire was breaking once more, she didn't react. She sat in the dark, breathing slowly. Not broken, but distant. She had done everything they asked, built weapons, tortured enemies, betrayed herself. And still, the galaxy turned without her. She wasn't set mourned, she wasn't set hunted. She was forgotten. And in that silence, something unexpected took root. Relief. She had become a shadow that no longer cast one. Her story, like so many others, would vanish between pages, not a warning, not a legend. Just missing. She didn't regret it. Not entirely. But sometimes in the quiet hours, she thought of Cade, of the way he looked at her, not with hatred, not with pity, but with something worse. Understanding. He knew what she had done, and what she couldn't undo. And maybe, just maybe, he forgave her. But she never forgave herself. She had seen thousands of Jedi fall. Some through poison, some through torture, others through memory fractures so precise they couldn't even remember their own names. She didn't see it as cruelty, she saw it as clarity, pruning weakness from the galaxy, stripping illusions, shaping truth. That was Darth Maladi's work. That was her role. That was her identity. So when they brought Cade Skywalker to her, she expected the same pattern to unfold. A captured Jedi, a damaged legacy, the broken bloodline of Anakin Skywalker, shattered by addiction, grief, and too many ghosts. Maladi saw no threat, only opportunity. She was calm as she began. Cade was different. Yes, his Force sensitivity ran deeper than most. There were instincts in him that reminded her of ancient Sith, sudden, raw, reckless, but that only made him easier to manipulate. More unstable, more prone to collapse under the right pressure. So she started slow. Pain wasn't the first tool. Memory was. She reached into his past, found the scars, amplified them. Let him feel his father's death again. Let him relive the moment the Jedi Temple fell. Whispered the same doubts she had used to destroy others. But Cade didn't collapse. He shouted. He resisted, and when she looked closer, she saw something she hadn't anticipated. He wasn't hiding from pain. He had accepted it. That was dangerous. She pivoted. Drugs, chemicals, neural reconditioning, the techniques she used to reprogram soldiers, to erase loyalty, to mold identity. Each one failed. Cade's mind recoiled, bent, but didn't break. She watched his eyes in the shadows. At first there was fear, then anger, then defiance, and finally, pity. He looked at her like he understood what she was doing, as if he'd seen past the needles, past the dark science, past the Sith robes and titles, and simply saw a woman trying to control what she could no longer understand. She told herself it didn't just matter. She doubled the dosage, introduced a new serum, one designed to erode will, not just thought. She isolated him, starved him of light, of sound, of context. He stopped speaking, but his mind didn't vanish. It got quieter, sharper. And in that quiet, Maladi began to feel something else. Doubt. Not in him, in herself. Cade Skywalker was meant to be her final triumph. A Jedi turned Sith not by blade or threat, but by corruption of the mind. She didn't want to kill him. She wanted him to choose to fall. She wanted the galaxy to see the grandson of Vader seduced not by power, but by despair. But Cade wasn't set following the script. He wasn't set folding. And she, for the first time in decades, felt unprepared. She increased the pressure. Vision suppressors, mind-fracturing stimuli, an artificial simulation loop where Cade believed he had escaped, only to be dragged back over and over, day after day. And still, he resisted. One night, when she watched the footage in silence, she saw him whisper something. At first, she thought it was a plea. Then she saw his mouth again. The same word again and again. Choice. Maladi stopped the playback. Rewound, replayed, slowed it frame by frame. Yes, he was saying it. He was reminding himself, over and over. Choice. She sat back in her chair. The word felt sharp in her mind. Too sharp. It was a word the Sith never used. Not truly. The Sith spoke of power, of will, of destiny, but not choice. That was a Jedi illusion, they said. A weakness, a lie the weak told themselves when they feared what they truly wanted. But Cade believed it. And the worst part was, she didn't know if he was wrong. She turned off the monitors, walked back into the room, stood over him. His body was trembling, worn down, drenched in sweat, but his eyes were still watching her. Still human. Still free. And for a split second, Maladi felt something inside her she had spent years burying. Not regret, but recognition. She began seeing herself in the cracks. Not in Cade, in the walls, in the lights, in the flickering surveillance screens that showed nothing but a boy refusing to fall. Maladi had always believed that control was a science, that the mind was circuitry waiting to be rewired, if not with words, then with chemicals. She believed memory could be reshaped, identity could be dismantled, fear could be installed like armor. But Cade Skywalker was not obeying the formula. And that meant the formula was wrong. She stopped reporting progress to Wirelock. She knew what he would say, that the subject should be terminated, recycled, or handed over to the Emperor's replacement programs. But she didn't want Cade to die. Not yet. She told herself it was because the experiment wasn't finished. But deep down she knew the truth. Cade had become a mirror, and she wasn't ready to stop looking into it. She adjusted the room temperature lower to see how his muscles reacted to strain. She shifted the soundscape to long periods of silence, interrupted only by distant echoes of familiar voices. Sometimes it was his father, sometimes his master, sometimes his own voice edited to speak doubts he'd never actually said. He closed his eyes more often now, but he wasn't broken. He was thinking. That terrified her more than anything. Sith were supposed to extinguish thought, suppress uncertainty, focus only on power. But she was beginning to see the flaw in that structure, not just in Cade's resistance, in herself. She couldn't stop remembering her own training. How Darth Krayt had shown her the path forward. How he said the Sith code was not enough, that survival meant adaptation, but even then she had seen the fractures. Krayt preached unity, but built his order on fear. He demanded loyalty, but trusted no one. Now she was repeating the same pattern. She told herself Cade was the key. But what if he was the question? What if she was still following Krayt's shadow, long after it had faded? The virus she had been developing, the one meant to destroy will, was nearing completion. She called it Vong-born, but it wasn't truly alien. It was personal. She had designed it not just to destroy resistance, but to understand it. Each strain mutated based on the subject's thoughts. It reflected the host's own mind back at them, distorted, hollow, empty. But when she exposed Cade to the first strand, nothing happened. No hallucinations, no emotional breaks, no signs of internal collapse. He simply stared at her, calm, tired, alive. That night she didn't tend sleep. She watched his breathing through the monitor. She measured his pulse. She reviewed the data for errors, then ran it again. It was real. The virus didn't work on him. Not because he was immune, but because there was nothing for it to hollow out. He had already faced his darkness and chosen not to run from it. He had accepted his pain. Maladi hadn't stepped. She paused the tests. For the first time, she requested solitude, shut down her lab, cancelled the guards, closed the observation deck, and sat in the dark. She remembered her home world, Kilora, long before the war, before she was taken, before the Sith. She remembered the feeling of wind in the crop fields, the strange way silence used to feel safe instead of dangerous. She remembered her name, her real one. She whispered it once, then buried it again. Because names didn't matter anymore, only results. Still, something had shifted, and Krayt, the one she'd planned to destroy, had caused it. She returned to the lab the next day and didn't speak. She simply watched. He didn't speak either, but he didn't speak either, because in that silence, they both knew something had changed. The virus hadn't yet failed. She had. He escaped on the 4th day. The restraints had been checked, the doors had been sealed, the guards had been warned, but still, Krayt Skywalker walked out. Not with rage, not with violence. He left because she let him. Not out of pity, not out of mercy, but because she needed to see what would happen if he lived. The guards assumed it was a breach. They filed alerts, deployed seekers prepared to recapture, but she overruled them. Quietly, without explanation, the pursuit was called off before it began. Krayt disappeared into the galaxy. No one questioned it again. But she did. For weeks, she said nothing. Continued her research, monitored the One Sith from the shadows, played her part, but inside, everything had stalled. Because he had looked back. Right before the final gate opened, the boy turned, just for a second. And in his eyes, there was no hate, only understanding. Maladi didn't know how to survive that. Hate was simple, predictable, easy to counter, but understanding, that was something deeper, something old. Something she hadn't felt since her mind was still her own. She reviewed the footage 100 times, paused the frame where he looked at her, zoomed in, analyzed the micro-expressions, lips neutral, eyebrows low, no smirk, no grin, no fear. He wasn't set mocking her, he wasn't set challenging her. He was releasing her. The Empire didn't notice when she stopped reporting. Wylock had taken over, the Sith moved on, the war machines kept spinning, but Maladi drifted into silence. The virus, the one she had poured herself into, was locked away in cryostasis, unused, unfinished, untested. She began dismantling her own systems, slowly, quietly. One chemical compound at a time, one illusion at a time. Not to destroy them, to understand them again. She read medical texts she hadn't touched in decades. She revisited her early journals, the ones before Krayt, before the reprogramming. She tried to remember why she had once wanted to heal, not control, why she chose biology, not war. She couldn't remember her mentor's name, but she remembered their voice. You can break the body to fix the soul. She had laughed at that line once. Now, she wasn't so sure. When the virus woke on its own, mutating inside its sealed chamber, she didn't try to contain it. She watched it evolve. She watched it rewrite itself. And in its patterns, she saw a strange shape. Not chaos, choice. It wasn't designed to kill. It was designed to decide. It learned from the host. It mirrored intention. It asked the subject, through chemicals and pain and memory, who they wanted to be. And then it pushed them there. The Sith called it dangerous. She called it possibility. Still, she didn't release it. Not into the world, not into the war. She released it into herself. She locked the doors, set the timer, injected the compound, and waited. For 3 hours, she trembled, not from pain, but from memory. Faces she had erased came flooding back. Her parents, her teachers, the first soldiers she dissected, the first life she spared, her first failure, her first life. Every moment she had buried returned. And for the first time since her childhood, she cried. Not because she was weak, but because she was real again. When the compound wore off, she didn't record the results. She didn't file a report. She didn't archive the data. She deleted the virus, then burned the lab. She left no trace, no cure, no weapon, only silence. Because Krayt had escaped, but so had she. She didn't leave the planet. She didn't need to. The war had moved on without her. The Jedi were scattered. The One Sith were crumbling. Darth Krayt had taken the throne, and Krayt, if he still existed, had retreated into legend again. Nobody was looking for her. Nobody remembered she was still alive. And maybe for the first time, she wasn't set. The laboratory was gone. The foundations cracked. The ceiling collapsed inward. The glass had melted to ash. The consoles were caked with black dust. She sat where the main console used to be, knees folded, breathing in what remained of her work. It didn't sting her lungs anymore. She had thought she'd feel lighter, emptied, purged. But what she felt was quieter than that. Not peace, but stillness. Maladi kept no weapons, no armor, just her hands, stained with chemicals and time. She wandered the halls that hadn't collapsed, looking at her old notes, not to reclaim them, but to say goodbye. The clones in stasis had long since decayed. The Bacta tanks were drained. The screams that used to echo off the walls were gone. She didn't miss them. They had never meant anything to her. They were tools like the virus, like the Force, like Krayt. But something had shifted. Not in the Force, in her. Because now, when she thought of Krayt, she didn't see a mistake. She saw a mirror. He had walked out, alone, with nothing but his will. He hadn't fought her, hadn't condemned her. He had seen her for what she was, and walked away anyway. And she hadn't stopped him. She could duff, but she didn't set. She didn't understand that choice when it happened, but now, in the ashes of her own empire, she began to. She wasn't set a Sith anymore. She wasn't set anything. And yet, she was still here. Still breathing. Still remembering. The thought should have terrified her, should have broken her mind. But instead, it steadied her. Because there was something beneath all the training, all the control, all the cruelty. There was someone. Maladi wasn't set her name. Not really. It was the name the Sith gave her, the name she had used to build plagues and break minds, the name that carried death like a cloak. She didn't know her real name anymore, but she whispered one anyway. A soft sound, a guess, a memory. She said it into the smoke and let it drift away. She didn't need a new purpose, or a redemption, or a final battle. She just needed to know she still existed outside the Sith. That something in her had survived. A knock echoed through the ruins. Not a sound, a presence. It didn't push, it didn't threaten. It waited. She didn't call out, she didn't draw her blade. She stood up, walked through the broken hall, and opened what remained of the entrance. No one was there. Only wind. Only sun. Only dust. And in the distance, the faint outline of a ship, vanishing. She smiled. Not because she understood it, but because she didn't set. That was enough. She turned back into the ruins, and for the first time since the day she joined the Sith, She started writing again. Not reports, not formulas, not code, just words, simple ones, on old cracked paper. And the first line read, "I was not born to destroy, I was taught." She didn't know what the second line would be, but she would wait for it. No longer trying to control the galaxy, no longer trying to cure it, only trying to remember who she was before the Sith told her who to become. And whatever remained in those ashes, in that silence, would be hers alone. The lab hadn't changed, not since Krayt's fall, not since the betrayal, not since the dreams stopped. Maladi moved through its halls like breath through a corpse, silent, steady, surrounded by the ghosts of machines she had once taught to lie. The stasis tanks were empty now. Their lights still flickered, but they no longer hummed. There were no more test subjects, no guards, no students, only echoes and dust that didn't settle. She still spoke to him, sometimes aloud, sometimes in her thoughts. She had seen him die, felt the moment his will left the galaxy. But in the walls of her sanctuary, Krayt's voice lingered like a toxin, his commands, his vision, his warnings. She didn't answer him with loyalty anymore, only with updates, status reports, as if she still had something to prove. "You were wrong," she whispered one day, standing before the broken remains of the embrace of pain. "About power, about fear, about me." The structure didn't reply, but she waited, as if it might. She didn't admit it then, not even to herself, but she had once believed in him, truly. She had seen in Krayt the order the galaxy lacked, the clarity she had never known. In him, she thought, the chaos of her own mind could be carved into something sharper than pain. But that belief had cracked slowly, then all at once. It wasn't when he died. It was before that, when he started looking at Waterlock the way he used to look at her. When she stopped being his mind and became just another tool. She hadn't left the lab since his fall. There were still systems here only she could understand, still data that no one else had the patience to decrypt. And she convinced herself day after day that her work still mattered, that it wasn't about memory, that it wasn't about guilt. But even she could feel the truth growing louder. The Sith were no longer watching, the galaxy was no longer listening, and Krayt was no longer speaking. The silence was not comforting. It was accusing. There were moments when she'd awaken in the middle of a thought, unsure if she'd spoken aloud or just remembered a conversation that never happened. She saw outlines in her peripheral vision, ghosts of test subjects, fragments of voices, sparks of life she once extinguished for progress. They didn't haunt her, they didn't blame her. They simply reminded her that she was still here, and they weren't. She hadn't eaten in days, not because she was starving, but because hunger helped her think, pain helped her remember. That was something Krayt had taught her, something she'd once passed on to others. Now it was all she had left to teach herself. The lab still functioned in fragments, life support, basic lighting, emergency power. That was enough. She didn't need anything more, except the mask. It still sat on her workbench, untouched since the night she removed it. Its smooth surface stared back like a memory too stubborn to fade. She hadn't worn it since Krayt died, and yet she hadn't discarded it. It was the one thing she couldn't destroy, not because it was sacred, but because she didn't know who she was without it. She reached for it once, just once, then pulled her hand away. Not yet. She kept a hollow recording of his voice. Not Krayt, someone else. A whisper buried deep in her private archives, encoded beneath layers of encryption even she had trouble unlocking on the first try. It wasn't Sith teachings, it wasn't a threat, it was a question, a voice she couldn't forget, no matter how long she pretended it never mattered. "Why do you hurt yourself like this?" She didn't know who had asked it. Maybe it was Cade, maybe it was someone long before him. Or maybe it was her own voice, recorded in a moment of clarity she hadn't felt since youth. But she played it sometimes, when the quiet pressed too hard against her chest, just that one line. "Why do you hurt yourself like this?" And then silence. Not everything inside her wanted answers. Some parts of her just wanted the question to stay. Cade had ruined something inside her, not with violence, not with rebellion, but with a kind of clarity that made her sick to remember. He looked at her and didn't see a Sith, didn't see a scientist, didn't even see an enemy. He saw someone who had a choice, and that made him dangerous. She had built an entire life on control, on cause and effect, on the belief that everything could be shaped, bent, weaponized. And then came Cade Skywalker, broken, defiant, disgustingly alive, and he refused every narrative she tried to write for him. He should have become her masterpiece. Instead, he walked out and left the pieces scattered behind him. And she couldn't stop thinking about him. She told herself it was strategic, that he was a threat, that his existence still posed a risk to the galaxy. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, he reminded her of herself. The part she buried so far down it no longer had a name. She began to dream again. That was the most terrifying part. Not about power, not about revenge, but about things that never happened. What if she had left when she was still young? What if she had walked away from Krayt? What if she had told Willierlock no? What if she had chosen something besides the mask? The virus she built to break willpower had never touched Cade, but his presence had shattered hers. She watched herself now, not as a scientist, not even as a Sith, but as something more pathetic, a woman who didn't know what came next, a survivor who never made peace with survival. The recordings grew longer, not of others, of herself. She began speaking to her databanks, not out of madness, but because silence no longer offered comfort. "I thought I knew what loyalty meant," she whispered one night, hunched in the corner of her control room. "I thought pain made me stronger. I thought the Force could be controlled like a system." She paused. "It can sit." Another night, another entry. "I don't know if I miss him, or just the version of myself I pretended to be when he was watching." Then another. "I lied. The virus worked. It just took longer. It infected me." And still, the voice from long ago returned. Quiet, patient, undeniable. "Why do you hurt yourself like this?" Because she didn't know what else to do. There were no windows left in the lab, not because they were destroyed, but because she had sealed them shut years ago. The galaxy outside was a distraction. Stars mocked her with their distance. Sunlight reminded her that time still moved. She preferred the dark, not because she feared the light, but because it didn't lie. It told her the truth she had built her entire life trying to avoid. She had become what she hated. Not a warrior, not a scientist, not even a Sith in the way Krayt had imagined. She was something else now, something small, something left behind. She told herself she was still planning, that her work mattered, that somewhere in the data swirling across her hollow screens, a secret weapon was waiting to be born, but the truth was simpler and far more painful. She was afraid of stopping. Because if she stopped, she would have to look at herself without the mission, without the mask. And that meant admitting the experiment had failed. Not the ones she ran on others, the one she ran on herself. Her body still bore the scars of her own designs, needles, stimulants, forced mutations. Every time her will began to fade, she reminded herself with pain, she was not a person. She was a weapon that had been her vow, but that vow no longer comforted her. Not since Cade. He hadn't just walked away, he left her with a mirror, a quiet, silent image of what she might have been if she had ever allowed herself to become real. Not a creation, not a tool, but something as raw and unfinished as him. And she hated him for it. But beneath that hate was something worse, jealousy. She moved slower now, not from age, from caution. Every movement forced her to reckon with the emptiness she'd built around herself. The lab was too quiet. The consoles responded too quickly. The hallways echoed her steps with a kind of mockery. Nothing resisted her anymore. And that was the problem. She had made herself into something untouchable, but in doing so she had removed every reason to be touched. There were no apprentices left, no rivals, no shadows creeping at the edge of her domain. Just silence, just her, and the ghost of a question she could never answer. She stood before the mirror sometimes, not for vanity, for proof that she still existed. The mask stared back. It hadn't changed, but she had, and she didn't know what to do with that. In her earliest years, before the teachings of the One Sith, before the blood and the vows, she remembered being afraid of the dark, not because of monsters, but because she couldn't see herself. That fear had returned. Not because she was lost, but because for the first time in her life she could finally see, and she didn't like what was looking back. Her shadow no longer belonged to the Sith. It belonged to her, and it didn't obey. It waited, not to strike, but to be acknowledged. She had built her life controlling what others feared, pain, death, failure, but her own fear had been simpler all along, the fear of being known, of being seen, of not being able to hide behind a title, a project, or a cause. The lab Sith's lights flickered once, and in that moment, she swore the shadow moved before she did. Not as an enemy, but as a warning. There was a chair in the center of the lab, simple, metal, burnt along one edge from a forgotten overload. It wasn't where she worked, it wasn't where she rested, it was where she waited. Maladi would sit there sometimes when the systems were quiet and the ghosts too loud. She didn't meditate, she didn't reach out with the force. She just sat, back straight, hands on her knees, eyes fixed on the wall across from her, as if something there might change. It never did. But she kept coming back. The galaxy had moved on. Darth Krayt was dead, his order shattered, the Jedi scattered and rebuilding. Cade Skywalker was a name whispered like a curse or a prayer, depending on which side you listened to. But she remained, unmoving, unyielding, unwilling to change. Because to change would mean admitting that she had lost. And she had. Her mind returned again and again to the simplest of truths. She had believed in something, even if it was twisted, even if it was monstrous, it was belief, and now, even that was gone. All she had left was the mask. Black durasteel, shaped to intimidate, narrow red lines running across the jaw, cold lenses where eyes should be, a mask made to erase the person underneath, a mask designed not to protect, but to replace. She picked it up with both hands. It was heavier than she remembered. Not physically, but in meaning. There had been times she wore it because it was expected, then because it was tradition, then because it was power. Now she wore it because it was the only identity she had left. Without it, she was just a woman alone in a ruin. And she didn't know how to be that. The mask slipped over her face with a hiss. The sound was mechanical, but it calmed her. Because in that moment, she could pretend she was still someone. Not Maladi, the Sith scientist, the torturer, the shadow, but someone with purpose, someone feared, someone real. She rose from the chair. Her steps echoed in the empty corridors, louder than they should have. Her lab was dying. Power cells degrading, air scrubbers weakening, the structural seals groaning under old stress. And she didn't yet fix them. She wasn't so sure why. Part of her still believed, or wanted to believe, that one day someone would come, not to rescue her, not to kill her, but to witness her, to look at what she had become, and say, "I see you." But no one came, so she filled the silence with routine. Checking systems that didn't need her, adjusting formulas that led nowhere, staring at data from tests that had no end. The process comforted her. Not because it mattered, but because it was familiar. And in a life of betrayal, that was enough. The door to the stasis chamber opened without her command. She hadn't entered it in weeks, maybe months. Time had become fluid here. Inside was nothing, just dim lights, frosted glass. Equipment meant to preserve something important, if she had anything left to preserve. She didn't step inside. She just stood there. Mask on, shoulders tight. Looking into a place meant for memory and realizing she had none worth freezing. That was the final truth. She hadn't lost her purpose. She had never really had one. Everything had been a reaction, a defense, a way to avoid the question that now screamed inside her empty mind. Who am I without the pain? No voice answered. So she turned and walked back to the lab. Not because she believed, not because she hoped, but because it was all she knew. And the mask remained. The lab was quiet now, the kind of quiet that presses against the skin. Maladi sat where she always had, alone, upright, surrounded by devices she no longer touched. There were no new test subjects, no Sith to impress, no empire left to save or betray. Only her, only the quiet and the mask. For years she believed control was mercy, that without it the galaxy would rip itself apart, that minds must be broken to survive the truth of power. She had seen Jedi flinch when they killed. She had watched Sith crawl begging to be noticed. Neither path made sense. So she tried something else, her own hypothesis that control could end suffering, not through peace, not through victory, but through design. Cade Skywalker had shattered that belief, not by killing her, not by sparing her, but by walking away. He'd stared at her virus, at the nightmare she called salvation, and said nothing, as if all of it, the years of work, the agony, the brilliance, didn't matter. And in that moment, she saw something worse than death, irrelevance. Now, her hands didn't move, her voice didn't speak, but her mind still worked. It sifted through old notes, old memories, trying to find what she missed, where the flaw had first appeared, not in the serum, not in the conditioning, but in her, a crack too small to see until everything leaked through. She remembered being a child on Iridonia. The rituals, the blood, the hunger, control had saved her then, made her useful to the Sith. It gave her purpose, and later shelter from grief. But control wasn't mercy. It was a cage, one she built for others, then forgot to unlock for herself. And still, she couldn't stop. Even now, with no audience and no future, she analyzed the angles of failure, the shape of pain, trying to prove it meant something. She looked at the mask. It hadn't aged, but she had. The Sith title meant nothing anymore. Darth Maladi was a closed file, a ruined room. But the need to understand that still lived, even if no one ever heard the answer. There was a time she believed she could measure identity, dissect it like tissue, program it like language, strip it to obedience, rebuild it with fear. She did this to others, over and over, until it no longer felt cruel, until it became routine. But now, in the stillness, she turned the scalpel inward. The subject was her. What made her loyal to Krayt? Was it fear of death or fear of becoming forgotten? She had dissected enemies, interrogated allies, remade entire species to serve a vision that never fully belonged to her. And yet, she wore the mark. She called him master. But in her mind, she always questioned him. Not aloud, never aloud, but she wondered if he fell, what remained. He fell, and nothing remained. She had created a weapon, the Vongspawn virus, designed to cripple Jedi through the Force itself, a work of horror, precision, genius. She should have felt pride, but Cade's refusal had exposed the truth. Her masterpiece was not a triumph, it was a confession. a cry for validation wrapped in code and suffering. What disturbed her most wasn't that he walked away, it was that she had hoped he wouldn't, that somewhere, under all the layers of control, she wanted him to understand her, to need her, to say that her pain had created something important. But he didn't truth. Now, the lab was both sanctuary and prison, a monument to questions no longer being asked. Each console blinked without purpose. The serum tubes were dry. The air recycling system hummed like a slow heartbeat, steady, indifferent. She ran simulations in her mind, not about war, about herself. What would have happened if she left the Sith after Krayt's first death? If she returned to Iridonia? If she buried the mask? She saw hundreds of paths, none of them peaceful, none of them likely, but one stood out, a version of her that never joined the Order at all. A healer, a thinker, a woman, not a weapon. It was the least likely outcome, but it was the one that stayed with her longest. She had never tested that hypothesis, and now it was too late. Obedience was the only thing she'd ever been praised for, not creativity, not kindness, not even cruelty, just obedience, efficient, silent, and complete. From the earliest trials in the Sith labs to the horrors she designed under Krayt's command, her success had always been measured by how well she followed orders. But the lie was this: obedience never gave her purpose, it only buried her under someone else's. Every decision she made was a reflection of someone else's will. Krayt's vision, Neil's threats, Wyalok's arrogance. Her brilliance was always filtered through chains. Even her defiance had to wear the uniform of loyalty. She began to see it too late. The missions weren't for her. The viruses weren't hers. The experiments, the torture, the deaths, none of it built something that lasted. All her obedience gave her was a seat in a lab no one would return to, carrying secrets no one cared to learn. Her hands trembled once, only once. She had injected herself with one of her own formulas, not to die but to feel what her test subjects had felt. The hallucinations came fast. She saw a little girl in a temple courtyard on Iridonia, standing barefoot on warm stone. Her father called her name, but she had no mouth to answer. Her mother wept, but her eyes were empty. The temple collapsed, the sky burned. Then the vision passed, and the lab returned. Dim, cold, still. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't moved. She just stared at her hands, waiting for them to remember who they belonged to. No one praised her for surviving. No one ever would. She realized then, purpose doesn't come from obedience. It comes from presence. And she had not been present in her own life for decades. She had memorized Sith codes, performed acts of terror, and remained invisible even to herself, all while pretending it was strength. In truth, she had been vanishing the whole time, shrinking behind titles, behind science, behind the safety of the mask. Now there was nothing left to obey, and still she stayed. Because without obedience, she didn't know how to begin. She moved slower now, not from age but from weight, the kind that sits behind the eyes, the kind that lingers in the spine. The lab was quiet, as always. The machines had powered down weeks ago. Even the flickering consoles had given up trying to display what no one would read. Maladi didn't need them anymore. What she searched for wasn't in the data, it was in the silence. She sat in the center of the room, cross-legged, the mask resting beside her, not worn, not forgotten, just there. Its edges caught the faint red glow from the emergency lighting. It looked different now. Not like armor, not like identity, just a thing. She had been called many things: Sith Lady, monster, genius, failure. None of them lasted. None of them held her. She had tried to shape others through pain, but the truth was simpler. She had never shaped herself. So in her final act, she did not inject herself with another serum. She didn't leave a message. She didn't ignite a weapon. She did nothing. She simply stayed. And as the hours turned into unknown days, the force around her quieted, not in fear, not in reverence, just quiet. No one came looking for her, not the Sith, not the Jedi, not the Empire that had once needed her then discarded her like waste. There were no footsteps, no transmissions, no alarms, just stillness. Her thoughts no longer raced, they walked. She remembered the feel of stone floors on Iridonia, the smell of her father's robes after long training sessions, the way her name had sounded when spoken without rank. She had buried all of it to survive, and now at the edge of death, or something like it, they returned. She didn't cry, that part of her had died long ago, but she did close her eyes, and for the first time in decades, she didn't flinch at what she saw in the dark. Her breathing slowed. The Force held its breath. And somewhere in the galaxy, the last file bearing her name corrupted itself into static. But on the floor of the ruined lab, the mask remained. Still, silent, waiting for no one.